The scattering of the Primarchs remains one of the most catastrophic events in human history, though its true implications would not be understood for decades to come. When the Chaos Gods tore the infant demigods from their gestation capsules on Terra and hurled them across the galaxy, each was destined for a world that would forge their character in ways the Emperor could never have anticipated. For the Primarch who would become known as Leman Russ, that world was Fenris, a death world of perpetual winter where only the strongest could hope to survive. The capsule containing the infant Primarch crashed into the frozen wastes of Fenris with tremendous force, creating a crater in the ice that would be remembered in tribal legends for generations. The impact occurred in the deep wilderness, far from any human settlement, where the temperature regularly plummeted to levels that would kill an ordinary human within minutes. The capsule's protective systems had been damaged during the chaotic journey through the warp, leaving the infant exposed to the planet's lethal environment. By all rights, the child should have perished within hours. Instead, the crying of the abandoned infant attracted a massive she-wolf, one of the apex predators of Fenris's frozen ecosystem. These creatures were not the wolves of ancient Terra. Millennia of evolution on a death world had made them larger, more intelligent, and infinitely more dangerous. The she-wolf that discovered the Primarch was particularly impressive, standing nearly as tall as a grown man at the shoulder, with ice-blue eyes that reflected an intelligence bordering on human. Her pack had been killed in a territorial dispute with a rival group, leaving her alone and without cubs of her own. The she-wolf's decision to adopt the human infant defied natural instinct, yet something about the child compelled her protection. Perhaps it was the Primarch's innate psychic presence, or perhaps the wolf recognized something in the infant that transcended species. She carried the child back to her den, a cave system carved into a cliff face that provided shelter from Fenris's howling winds. There, she nursed him alongside the few surviving cubs from her pack, teaching him the ways of survival in the harshest environment imaginable. The young Primarch grew with supernatural speed, as was the nature of his kind. Within months, he was walking and running with the pack, his enhanced physiology allowing him to survive temperatures that would freeze blood in a normal human's veins. The she-wolf taught him to hunt, to track prey across miles of frozen terrain, and to recognize the subtle signs that meant the difference between life and death in the Fenrisian wilderness. He learned to read the wind patterns that could indicate an approaching blizzard, to identify which ice formations were stable enough to cross, and to distinguish between the calls of different predators in the darkness. The pack hunted the massive elk that roamed the tundra, creatures with antlers spanning 12 feet and thick hides that could turn aside all but the sharpest weapons. They stalked the ice bears, solitary predators that stood 15 feet tall and possessed claws capable of rending steel. Most dangerous of all were the Fenrisian wolves themselves, rival packs that competed for the same territory and prey. The young Primarch learned that survival meant constant vigilance, that weakness invited death, and that the pack was everything. As he grew, the Primarch began to display abilities that set him apart even from his adoptive family. His strength exceeded that of creatures many times his size, and his senses became so acute that he could track prey by scent alone across vast distances. He could see clearly in the perpetual twilight of Fenris's winter, and his hearing could distinguish individual heartbeats from hundreds of yards away. Most remarkably, he seemed to possess an instinctive understanding of the pack dynamics that governed all life on Fenris, the complex hierarchies of dominance and submission that determined survival. The first humans the young Primarch encountered were a hunting party from the Russ tribe, one of the larger clans that inhabited the more hospitable regions of Fenris. They had been tracking a wounded ice bear when they stumbled upon the Primarch's pack feeding on a fresh kill. The hunters were hardened warriors, survivors of countless battles against both human enemies and the planet's indigenous predators, yet they were stunned by what they witnessed. A human child, no more than 10 years old by appearance, stood among a pack of Fenrisian wolves as their equal, sharing in their feast with blood on his hands and ice in his hair. The leader of the hunting party was Thengir, a grizzled veteran whose scars told the story of decades spent fighting for survival on Fenris. He recognized immediately that this was no ordinary child. The boy's physique was already that of a warrior, his muscles defined despite his apparent youth. his eyes holding an intelligence and ferocity that belonged to no human child. When Thengir called out to him, the boy responded in the growling, guttural language of the wolves, though he seemed to understand the human words. The she-wolf that had raised him positioned herself protectively between the hunters and her adopted cub, her hackles raised and fangs bared. For a tense moment, violence seemed inevitable. The hunters had their weapons ready, knowing that Fenrisian wolves were among the most dangerous predators on the planet. But the young Primarch stepped forward, placing a calming hand on his adoptive mother's flank, and spoke his first words in the human tongue, words that would echo through Fenrisian legend for millennia to come. Thengir recognized the potential in the wolf child and convinced him to return to the tribe's settlement. The she-wolf followed at a distance, unwilling to abandon her adopted cub entirely. The Russ tribe's Great Hall was a massive structure built from the bones and hide of great beasts, its walls decorated with the trophies of countless hunts. Here, the young Primarch encountered human civilization for the first time, though Fenrisian society bore little resemblance to the refined cultures of more civilized worlds. The Russ tribe, like all Fenrisian clans, lived by a code that valued strength above all else. Their society was built around the concept of the pack, with clear hierarchies established through combat and maintained through constant testing. Warriors earned their place through prowess in battle, and leadership was determined by the ability to inspire loyalty and fear in equal measure. The weak were cast out to die in the wilderness, while the strong rose to positions of power and responsibility. Thengir adopted the wolf child as his own son, giving him the name Leman Russ, Leman meaning wolf friend in the ancient Fenrisian tongue. The young Primarch adapted to human society with the same supernatural speed that had marked his physical development. He learned to speak fluently within weeks, mastered the use of weapons within months, and began to understand the complex social dynamics that governed tribal life. The culture of Fenris was shaped by the planet's unforgiving environment. Death was a constant companion, whether from the cold, from predators, or from rival tribes competing for the same scarce resources. This proximity to mortality had created a society that celebrated the warrior's death above all else. To die in battle was the highest honor, while dying in one's bed was considered shameful. The Fenrisians believed that warriors who fell in combat would feast eternally in the halls of their ancestors, while cowards would wander the frozen wastes as dishonored spirits. Honor was not an abstract concept on Fenris, but a practical necessity for survival. A warrior's word was his bond because breaking faith could mean death for an entire tribe. Oaths sworn before the fire were considered sacred, and oath breakers were cast out into the wilderness to face the wolves alone. This code of honor extended to all aspects of life. Warriors shared their kills with the tribe, protected the weak, and faced death without fear or complaint. Pack loyalty was perhaps the most fundamental aspect of Fenrisian culture. Just as the wolves of the wilderness survived through cooperation and mutual support, so too did the human tribes understand that individual strength meant nothing without the backing of the pack. A warrior fought not just for personal glory, but for the survival and prosperity of his clan. Betrayal of the pack was the ultimate sin, punishable by exile and death. Leman Russ embraced these values with the fervor of one who had learned their truth in the wilderness. His upbringing among the wolves had taught him the importance of pack loyalty on a visceral level, while his superhuman abilities allowed him to excel in the physical trials that determined status within the tribe. He quickly established himself as the greatest warrior of his generation, capable of feats that seemed impossible even by Fenrisian standards. The Emperor's arrival on Fenris marked a turning point not just for Leman Russ, but for the entire trajectory of the Great Crusade. By the time the Master of Mankind's expedition fleet reached the Death World, Leman Russ had already established himself as the undisputed king of Fenris, having united the fractious tribes under his banner through a combination of martial prowess, strategic brilliance, and the kind of charismatic leadership that seemed to flow from his very being. The scattered clans that had warred against each other for millennia now stood as one people, bound together by their loyalty to the Wolf King. The Imperial fleet that translated from the warp above Fenris was unlike anything the planet's inhabitants had ever witnessed. Massive vessels that dwarfed the largest sea krakens hung in the void like metal mountains, their hulls bristling with weapon batteries and launch bays. The flagship alone was large enough to house entire cities, its Gothic architecture and golden eagles marking it as something far beyond the crude but effective vessels that the Fenrisians used to navigate their world's treacherous seas. When the first Thunderhawk gunships descended through the planet's atmosphere, their roaring engines and armored hulls seemed like dragons from the oldest sagas. The Emperor chose to make planetfall not in the heart of one of Fenris's great settlements, but in the wilderness where Leman Russ had first been found by the wolves. This was no accident. The master of mankind possessed knowledge of his son's origins that went far beyond what any mortal could comprehend. He understood that to truly connect with this particular Primarch, he would need to meet him on terms that resonated with the fundamental aspects of his character. The landing site was a windswept plateau overlooking the frozen wastes, a place where the aurora borealis danced across the sky and the howling of distant wolf packs carried on the bitter wind. Leman Russ received word of the stranger's arrival through his network of scouts and hunters, warriors who could traverse the frozen landscape faster than any mechanical transport. The reports they brought back spoke of beings clad in golden armor who moved with purpose and discipline unlike anything seen on Fenris. These newcomers made no attempt to hide their presence, yet they showed no signs of aggression either. They simply waited on the plateau, as if expecting something or someone to come to them. The Wolf King's approach to this unprecedented situation reflected both his tactical acumen and his understanding of Fenrisian culture. Rather than marshaling his full forces or attempting to overwhelm the strangers through sheer numbers, he chose to meet them with a small retinue of his most trusted warriors. This decision demonstrated not weakness but strength, a leader confident enough in his abilities to face the unknown without the need for overwhelming force. The warriors who accompanied him were legends in their own right, men who had fought beside their king through countless battles and whose loyalty was absolute. When Leman Russ first laid eyes upon the Emperor, the recognition was instantaneous and profound. There was something about him that spoke to the deepest levels of consciousness, a sense of authority and power that made even the mightiest warriors feel like children in the presence of their father. For Leman Russ, who had never known his true origins, the moment carried an emotional weight that he would later describe as like seeing the sun for the first time after a lifetime of darkness. The Emperor's own recognition of his son was equally immediate. Despite the barbaric trappings of Fenrisian culture that Leman Russ wore, the wolf pelts, the crude but effective weapons, the ritual scars that marked his passage through tribal traditions, the Emperor could see the genetic perfection that lay beneath. This was unmistakably one of his lost sons, shaped by circumstances he had never intended, but forged into something magnificent nonetheless. The wild nobility that radiated from Leman Russ, the easy confidence with which he commanded the loyalty of his followers, the predatory grace that marked his every movement, all of these spoke to the success of the Primarch project, even under the most adverse conditions. The contest that followed was not born of hostility, but of necessity. Fenrisian culture demanded that leadership be proven through strength, and even the revelation of their blood relationship could not override the fundamental requirements of the society that had shaped Leman Russ. The Wolf King needed to test this golden stranger, who claimed to be his father, to measure his worth according to the only standards that mattered on a death world where weakness meant extinction. The Emperor, with his perfect understanding of human nature and culture, recognized this need and accepted the challenge without hesitation. The nature of their contest varied according to different accounts later recorded by imperial historians. Most agree that it began with feats of endurance and fortitude that spoke to Fenrisian tradition. A drinking contest of such excess that it would have slain a dozen mortal men, with Russ triumphing as he downed flagon after flagon of potent Fenrisian ale. This was followed by an eating contest, where Russ matched his father bite for bite, consuming the flesh of beasts so toxic that a single mouthful would have killed an unenhanced human. In both trials, Russ emerged victorious, his sheer constitution and Fenrisian upbringing allowing him to surpass even the Emperor's legendary endurance. Finally, the contest turned to martial combat. Here, Russ unleashed the full fury of his strength, speed, and primal ferocity, challenging his father in a test that shook the earth beneath their feet. Yet despite his prowess, Russ could not overcome the Emperor's unmatched skill and psychic dominance. With a single, decisive blow, not meant to kill but to end the duel, the Emperor brought Russ to heel. What remained constant across all accounts was the mutual respect forged in these trials. Russ, having won the contests of feast and drink, accepted his loss in battle with laughter and pride, recognizing in the Emperor not just a worthy foe, but a father who was his equal and better. The watching Fenrisians roared approval as their king met his match for the first time in living memory, witnessing a spectacle that blended their love of boasting contests with the deadly seriousness of warrior tradition. When the final blows were struck and Russ knelt in acknowledgement, the Emperor revealed the truth of their bond and the destiny that awaited them both. He spoke of the Great Crusade, of humanity's destiny among the stars, and of the role that Leman Russ was meant to play in that grand design. The revelation that he was not merely the greatest warrior on Fenris, but one of 20 genetically engineered demigods created to lead humanity's expansion across the galaxy struck Leman Russ with the force of a physical blow. Yet rather than being overwhelmed by the magnitude of this revelation, Leman Russ embraced it with characteristic directness. His upbringing among the wolves had taught him that pack hierarchy was determined by strength and wisdom, and he could see both qualities in abundance in the Emperor. The master of mankind's vision of human unity resonated with his own experiences of bringing the fractious tribes of Fenris together under a single banner. If such unity could be achieved on a planetary scale, why not across the entire galaxy? The Emperor's explanation of the Great Crusade's objectives aligned perfectly with Leman Russ's understanding of survival and dominance. Humanity was scattered across the galaxy, divided into countless factions that warred against each other, while alien predators and the forces of chaos threatened their very existence. Just as the tribes of Fenris had been stronger united than divided, so too would humanity benefit from unity under imperial rule. The strong would lead, the weak would follow or be cast aside, and the pack would grow until it encompassed every human world in the galaxy. The assignment of the 6th Legion to Leman Russ represented one of the most significant transformations in the history of the Space Marine Legions. The warriors who had been created from his genetic template possessed many of his physical and psychological characteristics, but their upbringing in the sterile laboratories and training facilities of Terra had produced soldiers rather than the kind of primal warriors that Fenris demanded. They were disciplined, skilled, and utterly loyal to the Emperor, but they lacked the savage edge that would make them truly effective in the kind of warfare that lay ahead. Leman Russ recognized this deficiency immediately upon meeting his gene sons for the first time. These were warriors who had been trained to fight according to the Codex patterns established during the early years of the Great Crusade, specialists in combined arms tactics and siege warfare who approached combat with methodical precision. They were undoubtedly effective, but they fought like machines rather than like the apex predators that their genetic heritage suggested they should be. The transformation that followed would reshape not just their tactical doctrine, but their very identity as Space Marines. The process of turning the 6th Legion into the Space Wolves began with the integration of Fenrisian culture into every aspect of their existence. Leman Russ understood that true warriors were not created through training alone, but through the adoption of a warrior ethos that permeated every aspect of life. The Legion's homeworld was relocated to Fenris, where new recruits would be drawn from the planet's population of survivors, rather than from the more civilized worlds that had previously supplied the 6th Legion's ranks. The selection process for new Space Wolves reflected the harsh realities of Fenrisian life. Potential recruits were not chosen based on academic achievement or noble birth, but on their ability to survive in conditions that would kill ordinary humans. They were tested in the wilderness, forced to hunt the great beasts of Fenris, and required to demonstrate not just physical prowess, but the kind of pack loyalty that was essential to survival on the Death World. Those who proved themselves worthy were inducted into the Legion through rituals that combined Imperial technology with Fenrisian tradition. The transformation of the Legion's culture extended far beyond recruitment practices. The rigid hierarchies and formal protocols that characterized other Space Marine legions were replaced with a more flexible structure based on the pack dynamics that Leman Russ had learned during his youth among the wolves. Companies became great companies, each led by a wolf lord who commanded through a combination of martial prowess and the respect of his subordinates. The emphasis shifted from following orders without question to understanding the spirit of those orders and adapting them to changing battlefield conditions. This cultural transformation was not without its challenges. Many of the Terran-born Space Marines who had served with the 6th Legion since its founding struggled to adapt to the new paradigm. They had been raised to value discipline above all else, to see emotion as weakness, and to approach warfare as a science rather than an art. The Fenrisian way of war, with its emphasis on individual initiative and savage aggression, seemed almost barbaric to warriors who had been trained in the finest tactical academies of Terra. Leman Russ addressed these concerns through a combination of patience and demonstration. He understood that his Terran-born sons were not inferior warriors, but products of a different environment, and he worked to show them how Fenrisian methods could enhance rather than replace their existing skills. The wolf-like pack tactics that had served him so well on his homeworld proved equally effective when applied to Space Marine warfare, allowing for rapid adaptation to changing battlefield conditions and the kind of aggressive pursuit that could turn tactical victories into strategic triumphs. The early campaigns of the Great Crusade that followed the Space Wolves' transformation provided ample opportunity to test these new methods in actual combat. The Legion was assigned to compliance actions on worlds that had proven resistant to Imperial diplomacy, places where the combination of human stubbornness and alien influence had created situations that required more than conventional military solutions. These were the kind of conflicts where the Space Wolves' particular talents would prove most valuable. The campaign on Dulan was among the first to showcase the transformed Legion's capabilities. The world had been settled during the Dark Age of technology, but had regressed to a feudal state dominated by techno-barbarian warlords who controlled ancient weapons of immense destructive power. Previous Imperial attempts at compliance had failed when conventional tactics proved inadequate against enemies who combined primitive savagery with sophisticated technology. The defenders fought from fortified positions that had been built to withstand orbital bombardment, using weapons that could destroy entire companies of Space Marines with single shots. Leman Russ approached the problem with the same combination of cunning and aggression that had served him on Fenris. Rather than attempting to storm the defenders' strongholds directly, he ordered his Space Wolves to adopt the tactics of the hunt. They infiltrated the planet's wilderness areas, moving in small packs that could avoid detection while gathering intelligence on enemy positions and capabilities. The Legion's enhanced senses, honed through Fenrisian training methods, allowed them to track their enemies through terrain that would have stymied other forces. The assault, when it came, was unlike anything the defenders had anticipated. The Space Wolves struck simultaneously at dozens of targets, using their intimate knowledge of the terrain to approach undetected, and their savage ferocity to overwhelm defenders before they could bring their superior weapons to bear. The pack tactics that had been developed for hunting the great beasts of Fenris proved equally effective against human opponents, allowing small groups of Space Marines to coordinate their attacks with devastating precision. The victory on Dulan established a pattern that would be repeated throughout the Great Crusade. The Space Wolves excelled in situations where conventional tactics had proven inadequate, bringing a combination of strategic flexibility and tactical aggression that could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Their reputation began to spread throughout the Imperial forces, earning them recognition as specialists in the kind of warfare that other legions found challenging. The compliance of chemists provided another opportunity for the Space Wolves to demonstrate their unique capabilities. The world was dominated by a techno-cult that had achieved a form of immortality through cybernetic enhancement, creating a society of machine-augmented humans who viewed organic life as inherently inferior. Their cities were vast mechanical complexes that operated according to predetermined algorithms, defended by automated systems that could calculate and counter conventional military tactics with mechanical precision. The cult's leaders had studied Imperial military doctrine extensively, using captured equipment and interrogated prisoners to develop countermeasures for every standard Space Marine tactic. They had prepared for siege warfare, drop-pod assaults and armored spearheads, creating defensive systems that could neutralize each approach before it could achieve meaningful success. What they had not prepared for was the kind of adaptive, instinct-driven warfare that the Space Wolves brought to bear against them. Leman Russ recognized that the enemy's strength lay in their ability to predict and counter Imperial tactics, so he deliberately abandoned conventional approaches in favor of methods that defied logical analysis. The Space Wolves attacked in patterns that seemed random, but were actually based on the hunting instincts that had been honed through generations of survival on Fenris. They struck where the enemy was weakest, withdrew when resistance stiffened, and regrouped for attacks from unexpected directions. The machine cult's defensive algorithms, designed to counter rational military strategies, proved inadequate against opponents who fought according to instincts that predated human civilization. The Space Wolves moved through the mechanical cities like wolves stalking prey, using their enhanced senses to identify weaknesses that no amount of calculation could have predicted. They turned the enemy's technological superiority against them, using the very predictability of mechanical systems to anticipate defensive responses and exploit gaps in coverage. The transformation of the 6th Legion into the Space Wolves required a complete reimagining of recruitment practices that would reflect the harsh realities of Fenrisian culture. Unlike other Space Marine legions that drew their aspirants from civilized worlds through formal selection processes, the Space Wolves adopted methods that mirrored the brutal trials of survival that had shaped their Primarch. The recruitment grounds were not academies or training facilities, but the frozen wilderness of Fenris itself, where only the strongest and most adaptable could hope to survive long enough to earn consideration for the Legion's ranks. The process began with the choosers of the slain, veteran Space Wolves, who traveled throughout Fenris to observe the planet's tribal conflicts and identify potential recruits. These warriors possessed an almost supernatural ability to recognize the qualities that would make a successful Space Wolf, looking beyond mere physical prowess to identify the kind of primal ferocity and pack loyalty that characterized the Legion. They watched from concealment as young warriors faced impossible odds, noting those who fought with the savage determination that marked true survivors rather than those who simply possessed superior training or equipment. The initial selection occurred during the Great Tribal Wars that swept across Fenris with seasonal regularity. These conflicts were not mere skirmishes, but massive campaigns that could involve thousands of warriors and determine the fate of entire clans. The frozen battlefields became testing grounds where potential recruits demonstrated their worthiness through actual combat rather than artificial trials. Those who showed exceptional courage, tactical acumen, or the ability to inspire loyalty in their comrades were marked for further observation. The chosen aspirants faced trials that would have killed ordinary humans within hours of beginning. They were stripped of their tribal affiliations and cast into the deep wilderness during the worst storms of Fenris's winter season, armed with nothing but basic survival gear and the knowledge they had gained during their upbringing among the tribes. The landscape itself became their enemy, with temperatures that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes and winds that could knock a grown man from his feet. Blizzards that lasted for days reduced visibility to mere yards, while crevasses hidden beneath thin layers of snow waited to swallow the unwary. The aspirants had to demonstrate their ability to hunt and kill the great beasts of Fenris using only primitive weapons. They stalked ice bears through terrain where a single misstep could mean death, tracked Fenrisian elk across miles of frozen wasteland, and faced down packs of wolves that tested their courage and determination. Each kill required not just physical strength, but the kind of tactical thinking that separated survivors from victims. They had to learn to read the subtle signs that indicated the presence of predators, to understand wind patterns that could carry their scent to prey, and to identify the weak points in creatures that possessed natural armor thicker than ceramite. The psychological trials were equally demanding. Aspirants faced the Drunken Remembrancer, a test that combined massive consumption of Fenrisian ale with the recitation of complex sagas that detailed the deeds of legendary heroes. The alcohol was potent enough to kill unenhanced humans, Yet the aspirants were expected to maintain perfect recall of stories that could last for hours while consuming quantities that would have incapacitated entire squads of Imperial guardsmen. This trial tested not just physical tolerance but mental discipline and the ability to function under extreme duress. The trial of Mordecai represented the final and most dangerous test that aspirants faced before induction into the Legion. Named after the two-headed wolf of Fenrisian mythology that guarded the gates between life and death, this trial required aspirants to venture into the deepest caves beneath Fenris's surface, where they faced creatures that existed nowhere else in the galaxy. These subterranean predators had evolved in complete darkness, developing senses and abilities that made them uniquely dangerous to surface dwellers. The caves themselves presented hazards that went beyond mere predators. Ancient ice formations created mazes that could trap the unwary for weeks, while pockets of toxic gas accumulated in low-lying areas where they could kill through a single breath. Underground rivers of near-freezing water carved channels through the rock, creating obstacles that required both courage and skill to overcome. The aspirants had to navigate these dangers while being hunted by creatures that knew every passage and hiding place in their domain. Those who survived the trials and proved worthy of induction faced the process of genetic modification that would transform them into Space Marines. The gene seed implantation followed the same basic procedures used by all Space Marine legions, but the Space Wolves had developed additional modifications that reflected their unique nature. The Canis Helix, a genetic quirk specific to Leman Russ's gene line, enhanced the natural predatory instincts of new recruits while also carrying the risk of genetic instability that could result in physical mutation or psychological changes. The organizational structure that emerged from this recruitment process differed significantly from the rigid hierarchies that characterized other Space Marine legions. Rather than organizing into companies of fixed size and composition, the Space Wolves adopted a system based on great companies that reflected the pack dynamics of their homeworld. Each great company was led by a Wolf Lord who commanded through personal charisma and demonstrated prowess rather than simple rank designation. These leaders were chosen not through political maneuvering or administrative skill, but through their ability to inspire absolute loyalty in their subordinates and lead from the front in the most dangerous situations. The great companies varied in size and composition based on the personality and preferences of their Wolf Lords. Some commanders preferred smaller, more elite formations that could operate independently for extended periods, while others led massive formations that could overwhelm enemies through sheer numbers and ferocity. This flexibility allowed the Space Wolves to adapt their organization to match the specific requirements of different campaigns and operational environments. Within each great company, the traditional Space Marine rank structure was replaced with titles that reflected Fenrisian culture and the pack mentality that dominated Legion thinking. Wolf Guards served as pack leaders and senior warriors, their authority based on combat experience and the respect of their subordinates rather than formal appointment from higher command. These veterans wore Terminator armor when available and carried the finest weapons that the Legion could provide, but their true authority came from their proven ability to lead by example in the most desperate situations. Long Fangs represented the heavy weapons specialists of the Space Wolves, warriors who had survived long enough to master the complex systems required to operate Devastator weapons effectively. Their nickname reflected both their advanced age by Space Marine standards and their role as the pack's long-range hunters, capable of bringing down the largest prey from distances that kept them safe from retaliation. These veterans possessed an almost supernatural ability to read battlefield conditions and identify the most critical targets, often turning the tide of engagements through precisely timed fire support. Grey Hunters formed the backbone of each great company, experienced warriors who had proven themselves in multiple campaigns, but had not yet achieved the veteran status of the Wolf Guard. They combined the savage aggression of younger Space Wolves with the tactical acumen that came from surviving numerous battles, making them ideally suited for the kind of flexible operations that characterized Space Wolves warfare. Their gray armor reflected their status as mature predators who had learned to balance ferocity with cunning. Blood Claws represented the newest members of each great company, young space marines whose genetic modifications were still stabilizing and whose combat experience was limited to the trials they had faced during recruitment. Their red armor markings warned other space wolves of their unpredictable nature, as the Canis helix could cause sudden surges of aggression that made them dangerous to friend and foe alike. These warriors were typically deployed in assault roles where their natural ferocity could be channeled effectively, though they required careful supervision to prevent their enthusiasm from compromising mission objectives. The integration of Fenrisian culture into Legion practices extended far beyond organizational structure to encompass every aspect of Space Wolves' identity. The importance of sagas in preserving the memory of great deeds became central to Legion tradition, with each great company maintaining detailed oral histories that recorded the accomplishments of its warriors. These stories served not just as entertainment, but as tactical instruction, preserving lessons learned in combat and ensuring that future generations could benefit from the experiences of their predecessors. The recitation of sagas became a ritual activity that strengthened the bonds between pack members and reinforced the values that defined Space Wolves' culture. Warriors gathered around fires in the great halls of their fortress monastery, sharing stories of heroic deeds and legendary battles while consuming vast quantities of Fenrisian ale. These gatherings served multiple purposes, allowing veterans to pass on their knowledge to younger warriors while maintaining the oral traditions that connected the Legion to its homeworld. Wolf totems played a crucial role in defining the identity of individual great companies and smaller pack units within the Legion. These symbols, carved from the bones and fangs of creatures killed during recruitment trials or significant battles, served as focal points for unit loyalty and sources of spiritual strength during combat. Each totem carried specific meanings that reflected the characteristics and achievements of the warriors who bore it, creating a complex system of heraldry that was immediately recognizable to other space wolves. The selection and creation of wolf totems followed ancient Fenrisian traditions that predated the arrival of the Emperor on the planet. Warriors earned the right to bear specific totems through deeds performed in combat, with the most prestigious symbols reserved for those who had demonstrated exceptional courage or tactical brilliance. The process of carving and consecrating new totems involved elaborate rituals that combined imperial technology with shamanic practices inherited from tribal culture. Rune priests occupied a unique position within the Space Wolves hierarchy, serving as both spiritual leaders and tactical assets in a way that had no equivalent in other Space Marine legions. These psykers drew their power not from the formal training provided by imperial institutions, but from traditions that stretched back to the earliest days of human settlement on Fenris. They viewed their abilities as gifts from the planet itself, rather than dangerous mutations that required constant monitoring and control. The training of rune priests combined practical instruction in the use of psychic powers with immersion in Fenrisian mythology and spiritual practices. They learned to read the patterns of fate in the casting of carved bone runes, to commune with the spirits of great wolves through meditation and ritual, and to channel the raw power of Fenris's storms through their own psychic abilities. This approach to psyker development produced warriors who were both more stable and more powerful than their counterparts in other legions, though it also made them somewhat suspect to imperial authorities who preferred more orthodox methods. The specialized units that emerged from this cultural integration reflected the unique tactical requirements of Space Wolves warfare. Wolf Scouts represented the elite reconnaissance specialists of the Legion, warriors who combined the tracking skills learned during their tribal upbringing with advanced imperial technology to create the most effective infiltration units in the Space Marine forces. These warriors could move through enemy territory for weeks without detection, gathering intelligence and preparing the way for larger formations to follow. The selection process for Wolf Scouts was even more rigorous than the standard recruitment trials, as these warriors needed to demonstrate not just physical prowess, but the kind of patience and cunning that characterized the most successful predators. They underwent additional training in advanced camouflage techniques, silent movement, and long-range marksmanship, developing skills that allowed them to operate independently in hostile territory for extended periods. Their role extended beyond simple reconnaissance to include sabotage, assassination, and the kind of psychological warfare that could demoralize enemy forces before the main assault began. The equipment used by Wolf Scouts reflected their specialized role and the harsh conditions they were expected to operate in. Their armor was modified for maximum stealth capability, with sound dampeners and visual camouflage systems that could make them nearly invisible to most detection methods. They carried specialized weapons designed for silent killing, including monomolecular blades that could cut through most materials without making sound, and modified bolt weapons that used subsonic ammunition to avoid detection. The tactical doctrine that governed Wolf Scout operations emphasized flexibility and individual initiative over rigid adherence to predetermined plans. These warriors were trained to adapt their methods to match local conditions and enemy capabilities, using their enhanced senses and Fenrisian-trained instincts to identify opportunities that might not be apparent to conventionally trained soldiers. Their reports provided Space Wolves commanders with detailed intelligence about enemy dispositions and capabilities, allowing for the kind of precise strikes that characterized successful pack hunting. The integration of these various elements created a legion that was unlike any other in the Imperial forces. The Space Wolves combined the savage ferocity of Fenrisian tribal culture with the advanced technology and tactical doctrine of the Space Marines, producing warriors who were equally comfortable fighting in the frozen wilderness of their homeworld or the void battles that characterized much of the Great Crusade. Their unique approach to warfare made them particularly effective in situations where conventional tactics had proven inadequate, earning them a reputation as specialists in the most challenging military operations. The transformation of Leman Russ from tribal king to Primarch of the 6th Legion brought with it responsibilities that extended far beyond conventional military command. While his brother Primarchs were designed to be generals, conquerors, and builders of the Imperium, Leman Russ was quietly assigned a role that would set him apart from all others, that of the Emperor's executioner. This designation was not ceremonial, but represented a carefully calculated decision by the Master of Mankind, who recognized that the Great Crusade would inevitably produce situations where conventional solutions would prove inadequate. The Emperor's selection of Leman Russ for this role reflected both the Primarch's unique psychological makeup and the particular capabilities of his legion. The Wolf King's upbringing among the predators of Fenris had instilled in him an understanding of necessity that transcended moral considerations. He had learned during his youth that survival sometimes required actions that civilized minds might consider barbaric, and this pragmatic approach to violence made him ideally suited for tasks that would have troubled other Primarchs. The pack mentality that governed his thinking allowed him to make decisions based on the greater good of the group, even when those decisions required the elimination of individuals who had once been considered allies. The Space Wolves themselves possessed characteristics that made them uniquely effective at fighting other Space Marines. Their recruitment from the death world of Fenris had produced warriors who were naturally more aggressive and adaptable than their counterparts in other legions. The Canis helix that marked their gene seed created enhanced predatory instincts that allowed them to identify weaknesses in enemy formations and exploit them with savage efficiency. Their pack-based tactical doctrine emphasized flexibility and individual initiative over rigid adherence to established patterns, making them difficult for other Space Marines to predict or counter. The development of specialized anti-Astartes tactics began almost immediately after the Space Wolves' integration into the Great Crusade. Leman Russ recognized that fighting other Space Marines would require methods that differed significantly from the conventional warfare that characterized most compliance actions. Space Marines were trained to counter the tactics used by human armies, alien forces, and even other enhanced warriors, but they were not prepared to face opponents who understood their capabilities intimately and had developed specific countermeasures for their standard operating procedures. The first requirement was psychological preparation for fratricidal warfare. The concept of fighting other Space Marines challenged fundamental assumptions about Imperial unity and the brotherhood that supposedly existed between all servants of the Emperor. The Space Wolves addressed this challenge through the integration of Fenrisian cultural concepts that emphasized pack loyalty above all other considerations. Warriors were taught to view other legions not as brothers, but as potential rivals whose loyalty to the pack could not be assumed. This mindset allowed them to overcome the hesitation that might have affected other Space Marines when ordered to turn their weapons on fellow servants of the Emperor. The tactical modifications required for anti-Astartes warfare focused on exploiting the predictable nature of Space Marine doctrine and equipment. Standard Space Marine tactics emphasized combined arms operations, with tactical squads providing flexible fire support while specialized units handled specific threats. The Space Wolves developed methods for disrupting these coordination patterns, using their enhanced mobility and pack hunting instincts to isolate enemy units and defeat them in detail before they could coordinate effective responses. The equipment modifications were equally important. Standard bolt weapons, while effective against most enemies, were less reliable against Space Marine power armor. The Space Wolves developed specialized ammunition types that could penetrate ceramite more effectively, including mass reactive shells that were designed to detonate after penetrating armor rather than upon impact. Their close combat weapons were modified to exploit the weak points in power armor systems, with many warriors carrying weapons specifically designed to sever the cables and joints that allowed powered armor to function. The Space Wolves also developed tactics for countering the specific advantages that other legions possessed. They studied the fighting styles and preferred strategies of their brother legions, identifying weaknesses that could be exploited in potential conflicts. The methodical approach favored by the Iron Warriors could be countered through rapid redeployment and attacks from unexpected directions. The disciplined formations used by the Ultramarines could be disrupted through the kind of savage assault that characterized Fenrisian warfare. The technological superiority of the Iron Hands could be negated through tactics that forced close combat where their mechanical enhancements provided less advantage. The first opportunities to test these specialized capabilities came during the compliance actions that followed the discovery of the Lost Legions. The exact nature of these conflicts remains shrouded in deliberate obscurity, but fragmentary records suggest that both the 2nd and 11th Legions were discovered to have committed acts that threatened the stability of the Great Crusade itself. The Emperor's response to these transgressions required a level of discretion and effectiveness that could only be provided by warriors specifically trained for such operations. The involvement of the Space Wolves in these actions was never officially acknowledged, but subtle evidence suggests their participation in events that led to the complete erasure of 2 entire Space Marine legions from Imperial records. The logistics alone of such an undertaking would have required the kind of specialized knowledge and equipment that the Space Wolves had developed for anti-Astartes operations. The psychological preparation necessary to carry out such orders would have been beyond the capabilities of legions that had not been specifically conditioned for fratricidal warfare. The aftermath of these conflicts saw significant changes in the composition and capabilities of the Space Wolves Legion. Veterans who had participated in the actions against the Lost Legions were quietly reassigned to specialized units within the Legion, where their experience could be preserved and passed on to future generations without compromising operational security. These warriors formed the core of what would later become known as the Deathsworn elite units that were trained specifically for the most sensitive operations that the Emperor might require. The burden of this knowledge created a psychological isolation that set Leman Russ apart from many of his brother Primarchs. While other Primarchs could focus on the glory of conquest and the expansion of human dominion, the Wolf King carried the weight of understanding that the Great Crusade's success might require the elimination of those who had once been considered allies. This knowledge affected his relationships with his brothers, creating a subtle distance that many interpreted as aloofness or arrogance, but which actually reflected the lonely responsibility of his unique role. The Emperor's trust in Leman Russ was absolute, but it came with expectations that extended far beyond conventional military command. The Wolf King was expected to make decisions that other Primarchs might find morally troubling, to carry out orders that required a level of pragmatic brutality that few could stomach. This trust was demonstrated through the provision of specialized equipment and intelligence that was not available to other legions, including detailed information about the capabilities and potential weaknesses of his brother Primarchs. The development of the Space Wolves' reputation as the Emperor's executioners was carefully managed to serve multiple purposes. Other legions were allowed to believe that the Space Wolves were simply more savage and less disciplined than their own forces, a perception that concealed the sophisticated training and specialized equipment that actually characterized the 6th Legion. This misdirection served as both operational security and psychological warfare, as potential targets would underestimate the threat posed by warriors they perceived as barbaric, rather than recognizing them as highly trained specialists in fratricidal combat. The intelligence networks that supported these operations were among the most sophisticated in the Imperial military. The Space Wolves maintained contacts throughout the other legions, often through seemingly casual relationships between individual warriors that actually served as information-gathering operations. These networks provided early warning of potential problems within other legions, allowing the Emperor to intervene before situations developed beyond the point where conventional solutions might prove effective. The training facilities on Fenris were modified to support the specialized requirements of anti-Astartes warfare. Mock battles were conducted using captured equipment from other legions, allowing Space Wolves warriors to familiarize themselves with the capabilities and limitations of potential enemies. These exercises were conducted under conditions of absolute secrecy, with participants sworn to oaths that carried penalties more severe than death for those who revealed operational details to unauthorized personnel. The psychological conditioning required for this role extended beyond simple preparation for combat against other Space Marines. The Space Wolves were trained to compartmentalize their knowledge and emotions, maintaining normal relationships with warriors from other legions, while remaining prepared to eliminate them if circumstances required. This dual existence created internal tensions that were managed through the strong pack bonds that characterized Fenrisian culture and the absolute loyalty that all Space Wolves felt toward their Primarch. The selection of officers for the most sensitive operations required careful evaluation of psychological profiles and demonstrated reliability under extreme stress. These warriors were typically drawn from the ranks of those who had proven themselves in conventional combat, but who also possessed the mental flexibility necessary to adapt to unconventional missions. They underwent additional training that prepared them for the unique challenges of operating against enemies who possessed intimate knowledge of Imperial tactics and capabilities. The weapons and equipment developed for these specialized operations represented some of the most advanced technology available to Imperial forces. The Space Wolves were provided with prototype weapons that had been designed specifically for use against Space Marine targets, including modified plasma weapons that could penetrate power armor more effectively and specialized ammunition that was optimized for anti-ceramic performance. Much of this equipment was never officially acknowledged to exist, with records of its development and deployment carefully compartmentalized to prevent unauthorized access. The operational doctrine that governed these missions emphasized speed, surprise, and overwhelming force applied at critical points. The Space Wolves were trained to identify and neutralize enemy command structures before organized resistance could develop, using their knowledge of Space Marine tactical doctrine to predict and counter likely responses. These operations were typically concluded before enemy forces could adapt to the unexpected nature of the attack, preventing the kind of prolonged conflict that might have attracted unwanted attention from other Imperial forces. The success of these operations reinforced the Emperor's confidence in Leman Russ and the Space Wolves, leading to additional assignments that further developed their specialized capabilities. Each mission provided new insights into the challenges of anti-Astartes warfare, lessons that were incorporated into training programs and tactical doctrine for future operations. The cumulative effect was the creation of a military force that was uniquely qualified to handle the most sensitive threats to imperial unity, regardless of their source or nature. The complex web of relationships that developed between the Primarchs during the Great Crusade reflected not only their individual personalities, but also the circumstances of their discoveries and the roles they were assigned within the Emperor's grand design. For Leman Russ, these relationships were shaped by his unique position as the Emperor's executioner, his Fenrisian cultural background, and the fundamental differences in philosophy that separated him from many of his gene-forged brothers. The bonds he formed and the rivalries that emerged would have profound consequences for both the Space Wolves Legion and the broader trajectory of the Imperium. The relationship between Leman Russ and Horus Lupercal began with mutual respect and developed into something approaching genuine friendship during the early decades of the Great Crusade. Horus possessed a charismatic leadership style that resonated with warriors from all legions, and his ability to inspire loyalty transcended the cultural barriers that often separated the Primarchs from one another. The War Master's tactical brilliance and political acumen impressed Leman Russ, who recognized in his brother a kindred spirit when it came to understanding the practical realities of warfare and leadership. Their early campaigns together demonstrated a remarkable compatibility in operational methods. While Horus favored the kind of combined arms tactics that maximized the effectiveness of his Luna Wolves, he appreciated the Space Wolves' ability to adapt to changing battlefield conditions and exploit opportunities that more rigid formations might miss. The two Primarchs developed a working relationship that allowed their legions to coordinate effectively during joint operations, with the Luna Wolves providing the strategic framework, while the Space Wolves handled specialized missions that required their particular expertise. The personal bond between the two Primarchs was strengthened by their shared understanding of the burdens that came with command. Both had been forced to make difficult decisions that prioritized military necessity over personal sentiment, and both understood that leadership sometimes required actions that would be judged harshly by those who had never faced similar choices. This mutual understanding created a level of trust that allowed them to speak frankly about topics that they might not have discussed with their other brothers. Horus's gradual corruption by the forces of chaos introduced subtle changes in his relationship with Leman Russ that were not immediately apparent to either Primarch. The War Master's growing ambition and his increasing resentment of the Emperor's authority created philosophical differences that had not existed during their earlier campaigns. Where once Horus had accepted the necessity of difficult decisions in service to the Imperium, he began to question whether those decisions served his own interests as well as those of humanity as a whole. The Wolf King's instincts, honed by years of survival on Fenris, began to detect something amiss in his brother's behavior long before the true extent of Horus's corruption became apparent. The subtle changes in scent, posture, and vocal patterns that might have escaped the notice of less observant individuals registered clearly to senses that had been trained to identify predators and prey. These early warnings created a growing unease that Leman Russ found difficult to articulate, as the changes were too subtle to justify direct confrontation, but too consistent to ignore entirely. The relationship between Leman Russ and Magnus, the Red, represented one of the most bitter and philosophically significant rivalries among the Primarchs. Their conflict stemmed from fundamental disagreements about the nature of psychic power and the proper relationship between knowledge and wisdom. Magnus viewed psychic abilities as tools to be studied, understood, and mastered through rigorous application of scientific principles. He believed that knowledge itself was inherently valuable and that the pursuit of understanding justified considerable risks, including those associated with delving into forbidden areas of study. Leman Russ approached psychic phenomena from the perspective of Fenrisian shamanic tradition, which emphasized respect for natural forces and the dangers inherent in attempting to control powers beyond human comprehension. The rune priests of his legion drew their abilities from what they perceived as the spirit of Fenris itself, channeling natural energies through rituals and practices that had been developed over millennia of careful observation. This approach prioritized practical application over theoretical understanding and emphasized the importance of maintaining proper relationships with the sources of power rather than attempting to dominate them. The philosophical differences between the two Primarchs manifested in heated debates during the Council of Nicaea, where the Emperor sought to establish official imperial policy regarding the use of psychic powers within the Space Marine legions. Magnus argued eloquently for the continued study and development of psychic abilities, presenting evidence of the benefits that such powers could provide to the Great Crusade. He demonstrated techniques that could enhance communication across vast distances, provide tactical intelligence that conventional methods could not obtain, and offer defensive capabilities against the psychic attacks that characterized many of humanity's enemies. Leman Russ countered these arguments with warnings about the corrupting influence of uncontrolled psychic power and the dangers of delving too deeply into areas of knowledge that were fundamentally hostile to human existence. He pointed to the shamanic traditions of Fenris as examples of how psychic abilities could be used safely when proper precautions were observed and appropriate limits were respected. The Wolf King's arguments emphasized the importance of practical wisdom over theoretical knowledge, suggesting that some forms of understanding were too dangerous to pursue regardless of their potential benefits. The Emperor's decision to restrict the use of psychic powers within the Space Marine legions represented a victory for Leman Russ's position, but it also deepened the rift between him and Magnus. The Crimson King viewed the Edict of Nicaea as a betrayal of everything he had worked to achieve, a rejection of knowledge and progress in favor of superstition and ignorance. His resentment toward Leman Russ intensified as he came to see the Wolf King as the primary architect of policies that would cripple the Thousand Sons Legion and prevent humanity from achieving its full psychic potential. The enforcement of the Edict of Nicaea created additional tensions between the two Primarchs, as Leman Russ was tasked with ensuring compliance among legions that had previously relied heavily on psychic abilities. The Space Wolves' role as the Emperor's executioners made them natural candidates for such enforcement actions, but it also placed them in direct opposition to Magnus and his followers. The Thousand Sons' continued use of psychic powers in violation of imperial decree created a situation that would eventually require direct intervention. The relationship between Leman Russ and Vulcan was characterized by mutual respect based on shared values of loyalty, protection of the innocent, and personal honor. Both Primarchs had been shaped by cultures that emphasized the importance of community bonds and the responsibilities that came with strength. Vulcan's upbringing on Nocturne had instilled in him a deep commitment to protecting those who could not protect themselves, while Leman Russ's experiences on Fenris had taught him the importance of pack loyalty and mutual support among warriors. Their personal interactions were marked by an easy camaraderie that transcended the formal protocols that governed relationships between other Primarchs. Both were comfortable with direct communication and practical approaches to problem solving, preferring action to lengthy deliberation when circumstances demanded immediate response. This compatibility extended to their legions, with the Salamanders and Space Wolves developing effective coordination during joint operations despite their different tactical specializations. The bond between Vulcan and Leman Russ was strengthened by their shared understanding of the costs associated with warfare and their commitment to minimizing unnecessary suffering. While both were capable of tremendous violence when circumstances required it, they preferred solutions that achieved military objectives without causing excessive collateral damage. This approach sometimes put them at odds with other Primarchs who prioritized efficiency over humanitarian concerns, but it created a foundation of mutual trust that endured throughout the Great Crusade. The relationship with Rogel Dorn was built on professional respect and shared commitment to duty, though it lacked the personal warmth that characterized Leman Russ's bond with Vulcan. Dorn's methodical approach to warfare and his emphasis on defensive strategies represented a stark contrast to the Space Wolves' preference for aggressive, adaptive tactics. However, both Primarchs shared an absolute loyalty to the Emperor and a willingness to undertake any mission that served the Imperium's interests, regardless of personal cost. Their different approaches to military command created opportunities for effective cooperation when their legions operated together. The Imperial Fist's expertise in siege warfare and defensive operations complemented the Space Wolves' abilities in reconnaissance and rapid assault, allowing combined forces to handle a wider range of tactical situations than either legion could manage independently. The personal relationship between the two Primarchs remained cordial but distant, based more on professional necessity than genuine friendship. The tensions between Leman Russ and Robute Guilliman reflected fundamental differences in their approaches to organization, strategy, and the proper conduct of warfare. Guilliman's development of the Codex Astartes represented an attempt to systematize space marine operations according to logical principles that could be applied consistently across different situations and environments. His belief in the value of standardized procedures and hierarchical command structures conflicted directly with the Space Wolves' emphasis on flexibility and individual initiative. The philosophical differences between the two Primarchs became apparent during joint operations, where their different approaches to command and control created coordination difficulties. Guilliman preferred detailed planning and careful coordination between different units, with contingency plans prepared for various scenarios that might develop during combat. Leman Russ favored more adaptive approaches that allowed individual commanders to respond to changing conditions based on their assessment of local situations. These differences in tactical philosophy reflected deeper disagreements about the nature of leadership and the proper relationship between commanders and their subordinates. Guilliman believed that effective military organizations required clear chains of command and standardized procedures that could ensure consistent performance regardless of the individuals involved. Leman Russ argued that true leadership required personal bonds between commanders and their followers, relationships that could not be reduced to formal procedures or organizational charts. The debates between the two Primarchs often centered on questions of scalability and sustainability in military operations. Guilliman's methods were designed to work effectively across the vast distances and diverse conditions that characterized the Great Crusade, providing frameworks that could be applied by commanders who lacked the personal charisma or tactical genius of the Primarchs themselves. Leman Russ's approaches worked extremely well within the context of the Space Wolves Legion, but Guilliman questioned whether they could be successfully adopted by other forces without the specific cultural background and training that characterized Fenrisian warriors. The relationship between Leman Russ and Lionel Johnson was complicated by their similar roles as the Emperor's enforcers and their different approaches to handling sensitive missions. Both Primarchs commanded legions that were trusted with operations that required absolute discretion and unwavering loyalty, but their methods for achieving these objectives differed significantly. The Dark Angel's emphasis on secrecy and compartmentalized knowledge contrasted with the Space Wolves' reliance on pack bonds and shared understanding among all members of the Legion. Personal interactions between the two Primarchs were often marked by subtle competition and mutual assessment, as each recognized in the other a potential rival for the Emperor's trust and favor. Their similar capabilities and overlapping responsibilities created natural tensions that were exacerbated by their different personalities and leadership styles. Lionel Johnson's reserved, calculating approach to interpersonal relationships conflicted with Leman Russ's more direct and emotionally expressive communication style. The competition between the two Primarchs occasionally manifested in formal contests and challenges that tested their respective abilities in various areas of expertise. These competitions served multiple purposes, allowing both leaders to assess each other's capabilities, while providing their followers with opportunities to demonstrate their own skills and loyalty. The outcomes of these contests were typically inconclusive, with each Primarch demonstrating superiority in areas that reflected their particular strengths and training. The relationship with Jagatai Khan was characterized by mutual respect for each other's tactical abilities and appreciation for the challenges of leading warrior cultures that differed significantly from mainstream imperial norms. Both Primarchs commanded legions that drew their strength from tribal traditions and cultural practices that emphasized personal honor and individual initiative. The White Scar's emphasis on mobility and rapid strike tactics complemented the Space Wolves' abilities in reconnaissance and pursuit operations, creating opportunities for effective cooperation during joint campaigns. The personal bond between Jagatai Khan and Leman Russ was strengthened by their shared understanding of the challenges associated with integrating tribal warriors into the larger imperial military structure. Both had faced criticism from other Primarchs who questioned whether their methods could produce the kind of disciplined, reliable forces that the Great Crusade required. Their success in proving these critics wrong created a foundation of mutual respect that transcended their different cultural backgrounds and tactical specializations. The Council of Nicaea represented one of the most significant turning points in the relationship between the Primarchs and their father, the Emperor of Mankind. Convened in the early decades of the 31st millennium, this gathering was intended to resolve the growing tensions surrounding the use of psychic powers within the Space Marine legions. For Leman Russ, the Council provided an opportunity to voice concerns that had been building since his first encounters with Magnus the Red and the practices of the Thousand Sons Legion. The Wolf King's testimony would prove instrumental in shaping imperial policy regarding psychers, though the consequences of these decisions would reverberate far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. The Grand Amphitheater on Nicaea had been constructed specifically for this momentous gathering, its soaring architecture designed to accommodate not only the Primarchs and their retinues, but also representatives from across the Imperium who had been summoned to provide testimony. The structure itself seemed to embody the gravity of the proceedings, with massive columns supporting a dome that stretched toward the heavens, as if reaching for divine guidance in the deliberations that would follow. Banners bearing the heraldry of the Space Marine legions hung from the walls, while the golden aquila dominated the space above the Emperor's throne, its wings spread wide as if to encompass all of humanity under its protection. When Leman Russ rose to address the assembly, his presence commanded immediate attention. The Wolf King had chosen to appear in his full ceremonial regalia, wearing the pelts of great beasts from Fenris alongside the sophisticated armor that marked his status as a Primarch. His massive frame dominated the speaker's podium, while his ice-blue eyes swept across the gathered delegates with the intensity of a predator assessing potential threats. The contrast between his barbaric appearance and the refined setting served to emphasize the fundamental differences in perspective that would define the Council's proceedings. The Wolf King's testimony began with a detailed explanation of the shamanic traditions that had governed the use of psychic powers on Fenris for millennia before the arrival of Imperial forces. He described how the planet's harsh environment had produced a culture that understood the importance of respecting natural forces rather than attempting to dominate them through pure will or intellectual analysis. The rune priests of his legion, he argued, drew their abilities from the living spirit of Fenris itself, channeling energies that were fundamentally different from the dangerous powers that other psychers sought to manipulate. The distinction that Leman Russ drew between shamanic traditions and what he termed sorcery was central to his argument before the council. He explained that the rune priests operated within carefully defined parameters that had been established through generations of trial and error, using rituals and practices that served to limit their exposure to the corrupting influences that lurked beyond the veil of reality. Their powers were drawn from natural sources that could be trusted, unlike the alien energies that sorcerers sought to harness through forbidden knowledge and dangerous experimentation. The Wolf King's testimony included specific examples of the dangers he had witnessed when psychers overstepped the boundaries of safe practice. He spoke of tribal shamans on Fenris who had been consumed by forces they could not control, their minds shattered by contact with entities that existed beyond human comprehension. These cautionary tales served to illustrate his broader point about the need for restraint and proper preparation when dealing with psychic phenomena, emphasizing that wisdom lay not in pushing the boundaries of what was possible, but in understanding and respecting the limits that protected humanity from forces that sought its destruction. The contrast between Leman Russ's measured approach and Magnus, the Red's ambitious vision, became increasingly apparent as the proceedings continued. Where the Crimson King advocated for expanded research and development of psychic abilities, arguing that such powers represented humanity's evolutionary destiny, the Wolf King counseled caution and restraint. He pointed out that the shamanic traditions of Fenris had survived for thousands of years precisely because they emphasized safety over power, wisdom over knowledge, and practical application over theoretical understanding. The Emperor's attention during Leman Russ's testimony was absolute, his golden features remaining impassive as he absorbed every word and nuance of his son's arguments. The Master of Mankind had witnessed firsthand the consequences of uncontrolled psychic experimentation during the Dark Age of technology, when humanity's reckless pursuit of forbidden knowledge had nearly led to its extinction. The Wolf King's emphasis on traditional safeguards and proven methods resonated with the Emperor's own understanding of the dangers that lay hidden in the Imperium. The technical aspects of Leman Russ's testimony revealed the sophisticated understanding that lay beneath his apparently primitive approach to psychic phenomena. He described in detail how Fenrisian rune priests used carved bone talismans to focus their abilities, explaining that these physical anchors served to prevent their consciousness from drifting too far into the realm of spirits and shadows. The runes themselves were not merely decorative, but represented a complex symbolic language that had been refined over generations to provide maximum protection against psychic backlash and supernatural corruption. The Wolf King's explanation of how his legion's psykers differed from those in other forces was particularly compelling to the assembled delegates. He demonstrated how rune priests could predict weather patterns, track enemies across vast distances, and communicate with the spirits of fallen warriors without exhibiting the physical and psychological degradation that often affected other psykers. Their abilities seemed more stable and reliable than those displayed by librarians from other legions, lending credibility to his arguments about the superiority of traditional methods over innovative techniques. The political implications of Leman Russ's testimony extended far beyond the immediate question of psychic regulation. His support for the Emperor's growing concerns about uncontrolled psychic experimentation aligned him with the conservative faction that sought to limit the influence of psykers within imperial institutions. This position put him at odds not only with Magnus, but also with several other Primarchs who viewed psychic abilities as valuable tools that should be developed rather than restricted. The Wolf King's arguments gained additional weight from his reputation as a practical warrior who had proven his loyalty through decades of faithful service. Unlike some of the other participants in the debate, Leman Russ could not be accused of having personal or political motivations for his position. His concerns about psychic dangers were clearly based on genuine experience and observation rather than theoretical considerations or factional allegiances. When the Emperor finally rendered his decision in favor of the Edict of Nicaea, the vindication of Leman Russ's position was complete. The restrictions placed on psychic activities within the Space Marine legions reflected many of the concerns that the Wolf King had raised during his testimony. However, the implementation of these new policies would prove more complex than anyone had anticipated, particularly regarding the status of the Space Wolves' own rune priests. The aftermath of the Council of Nicaea created a delicate situation for Leman Russ and his legion. While the Wolf King had successfully argued for restrictions on psychic activities, the edict technically applied to all Space Marine psykers, including the rune priests who served with the Space Wolves. The distinction between shamanic traditions and sorcery that had been central to his testimony now became a practical challenge that required careful navigation to avoid charges of hypocrisy or disobedience. The solution that emerged reflected both the political realities of the situation and the genuine differences between Fenrisian shamanic practices and the more dangerous forms of psychic manipulation that the edict was designed to prevent. The Space Wolves maintained that their rune priests were not true psychers in the sense that the term was understood by imperial authorities, but rather practitioners of ancient traditions that predated the arrival of the Emperor on Fenris. This distinction allowed them to continue using their abilities while technically complying with the spirit, if not the letter, of the new regulations. The implementation of this policy required considerable discretion and careful management of information flow within the Legion. Rune priests continued to serve in their traditional roles, but their activities were conducted with greater secrecy than had previously been necessary. Training programs were modified to emphasize the historical and cultural aspects of shamanic practice, while downplaying the overtly psychic elements that might attract unwanted attention from Imperial inspectors. The continued use of rune priests created internal tensions within the Space Wolves that had not existed before the Council of Nicaea. Some warriors questioned whether their legion was truly following the Emperor's will, while others argued that their shamanic traditions were fundamentally different from the dangerous practices that the edict was designed to prevent. These debates reflected broader questions about the relationship between loyalty and obedience that would become increasingly important as the Great Crusade progressed. The growing tensions with the Thousand Sons Legion represented one of the most significant consequences of the Council of Nicaea for Leman Russ and his warriors. Magnus, the Red's bitter resentment over the restrictions placed on his legion's activities, created a personal animosity that went far beyond tactical or strategic disagreements. The Crimson King viewed the Wolf King as the primary architect of policies that threatened to destroy everything he had worked to achieve, while Leman Russ saw Magnus's continued defiance as evidence of the corruption he had warned against. The philosophical differences between the two Primarchs became increasingly irreconcilable as Magnus continued to pursue forbidden knowledge despite the explicit prohibitions of the edict. Intelligence reports reaching the Space Wolves suggested that the Thousand Sons were not only maintaining their psychic practices, but actually expanding them, delving deeper into areas of study that the Council of Nicaea had specifically forbidden. These activities represented a direct challenge to imperial authority that could not be ignored indefinitely. The Wolf King's role as the Emperor's executioner made him the natural choice to address the growing problem of Magnus's defiance. The specialized training and equipment that the Space Wolves had developed for operations against other Space Marines would prove essential if direct action became necessary. The prospect of fratricidal warfare troubled many within the Legion, but their absolute loyalty to the Emperor and their understanding of the dangers posed by uncontrolled psychic experimentation overrode personal reservations about fighting their gene-forged brothers. The intelligence networks that monitored the activities of other legions provided increasingly disturbing reports about the Thousand Sons' continued violations of imperial policy. These reports described rituals and experiments that went far beyond anything that had been discussed during the Council of Nicaea, suggesting that Magnus and his followers were actively seeking to expand their psychic abilities regardless of the risks involved. The evidence pointed to contact with entities from beyond the material realm, precisely the kind of dangerous experimentation that the edict had been designed to prevent. The deteriorating situation created a sense of inevitability that weighed heavily on Leman Russ as he prepared his legion for what seemed like an unavoidable confrontation. The Wolf King's loyalty to the Emperor was absolute, but the prospect of destroying an entire legion of Space Marines represented a burden that even his pragmatic nature found difficult to bear. The bonds of brotherhood that supposedly united all the Primarchs were being tested in ways that no one had anticipated when the Great Crusade began. The specialized equipment and tactics that the Space Wolves had developed for anti-Astartes warfare were quietly refined and updated as the situation with the Thousand Suns continued to deteriorate. Training exercises became more focused on scenarios that might arise during operations against psychically enhanced opponents, while new weapons and ammunition types were developed to counter the specific advantages that the Thousand Suns possessed. These preparations were conducted with the utmost secrecy, as premature revelation of their purpose might have precipitated the very conflict they were designed to address. The psychological preparation required for potential action against the Thousand Suns represented one of the most challenging aspects of the situation. The Space Wolves had to maintain their readiness for fratricidal warfare while continuing to operate alongside other legions during normal Great Crusade operations. This dual existence required a level of compartmentalization that tested even the strongest bonds of pack loyalty that characterized Fenrisian culture. The growing isolation of Magnus and his legion became increasingly apparent as other Primarchs began to distance themselves from the Thousand Suns. The Crimson King's defiant stance regarding the Edict of Nicaea had made him a controversial figure within the broader imperial hierarchy, while his continued pursuit of forbidden knowledge raised questions about his loyalty to the Emperor's vision for humanity's future. This isolation made it easier for the Space Wolves to prepare for potential action without attracting unwanted attention or interference from other forces. The machinations that would lead to the destruction of Prospero began not on the crystalline world of the Thousand Suns, but in the depths of space aboard the flagship of the War Master. Horus Lupercal, already well advanced in his corruption by the ruinous powers, recognized the opportunity that Magnus the Red's continued defiance presented. The Crimson King's desperate attempt to warn the Emperor of the impending betrayal had shattered the psychic barriers protecting Terra, breaching the Imperial Palace's most sacred defenses and damaging the Emperor's great work in the dungeons beneath the throne world. This transgression, however well-intentioned, provided Horus with the perfect weapon to eliminate one of his most potentially dangerous brothers, while simultaneously removing a legion that might have opposed his rebellion. The orders that reached Leman Russ aboard his flagship, the Hrafnkel, bore the Emperor's personal seal and carried the weight of absolute imperial authority. The initial mission parameters were clear and unambiguous. Magnus the Red was to be brought to Terra to answer for his violations of the Edict of Nicaea and his catastrophic breach of the Imperial Palace's defenses. The Thousand Suns Legion was to be disbanded, its warriors reassigned to other forces or subjected to whatever punishment the Emperor deemed appropriate. The Wolf King was to ensure Magnus's compliance through whatever means necessary, but the Crimson King was to be taken alive if at all possible. Horus's intervention in these orders was subtle but decisive. The War Master possessed the authority to modify mission parameters based on changing tactical situations, a privilege that had been granted during his elevation to supreme command of the Great Crusade. When he contacted Leman Russ during the Space Wolves' approach to the Prospero system, his arguments were compelling and appeared to be based on legitimate strategic concerns. Intelligence reports suggested that the Thousand Suns had been further corrupted by their exposure to forbidden knowledge, making them too dangerous to be taken alive. The psychic powers they wielded posed an unacceptable risk to any force attempting to capture rather than destroy them. The War Master's manipulation was masterful in its appeal to Leman Russ's fundamental nature and his understanding of necessity. Horus emphasized the dangers that psychically enhanced enemies posed to conventional forces, pointing to examples from the Great Crusade where such opponents had inflicted devastating casualties on Imperial armies. He reminded the Wolf King of his own testimony at the Council of Nicaea, where he had warned of the corrupting influence of uncontrolled psychic experimentation. The logical conclusion, Horus argued, was that Magnus and his legion had progressed beyond the point where capture and rehabilitation were possible options. The modified orders that emerged from this communication transformed the mission from a compliance action into an extermination campaign. The Space Wolves were no longer tasked with bringing Magnus to Terra for judgment, but with eliminating the threat that the Thousand Suns posed to Imperial security. The change was presented as a tactical adjustment based on updated intelligence, rather than a fundamental alteration of mission objectives, making it easier for Leman Russ to accept without questioning the underlying motivations. The Wolf King's acceptance of these modified orders reflected both his absolute loyalty to imperial authority and his practical understanding of the challenges involved in capturing a psychically enhanced Primarch. Magnus the Red was among the most powerful psykers in the galaxy, capable of feats that defied conventional understanding of what was possible through mental discipline alone. The prospect of attempting to take such an opponent alive while minimizing casualties among his own forces seemed unrealistic at best, potentially catastrophic at worst. The forces assembled for the assault on Prospero represented one of the most formidable military formations ever deployed during the Great Crusade. The Space Wolves committed significant portions of their legion to the operation, including veteran formations that had been specifically trained for anti-Astartes warfare. These warriors carried specialized equipment designed to counter the advantages that psychically enhanced opponents possessed, including weapons and ammunition optimized for penetrating the enhanced defenses that sorcery could provide. The Adeptus Custodes contingent assigned to the operation brought capabilities that even the Space Wolves could not match. These golden-armored warriors represented the Emperor's personal guard, genetically enhanced beings whose combat abilities surpassed even those of Space Marines. Their presence served multiple purposes, providing additional firepower for the assault while also ensuring that the mission was carried out according to Imperial directives. The Custodians' absolute loyalty to the Emperor made them ideal overseers for an operation that required complete discretion and unwavering commitment to success. The Sisters of Silence formed the third component of the assault force, their unique abilities making them perhaps the most crucial element in the planned operation. These warrior women possessed the rare genetic trait known as the pariah gene, which created a null field that suppressed psychic phenomena in their immediate vicinity. Their presence would neutralize many of the advantages that the Thousand Sons derived from their sorceress abilities, forcing Magnus's warriors to fight as conventional Space Marines rather than as psychically enhanced super soldiers. The approach to Prospero was conducted with the methodical precision that characterized all Space Wolves operations. Scout formations infiltrated the system weeks before the main assault force, gathering intelligence on defensive positions and identifying key targets for the initial strikes. These reconnaissance missions revealed a world that had been transformed by decades of psychic experimentation, its crystalline spires and arcane laboratories representing a level of technological and mystical advancement that exceeded anything found on most Imperial worlds. The planetary defenses that protected Prospero were formidable, but designed primarily to counter conventional threats rather than the specialized capabilities that the assault force possessed. Orbital defense platforms and surface-to-space weapon batteries could have devastated a standard invasion fleet, but the Sisters of Silence's null fields disrupted the psychic targeting systems that many of these weapons relied upon. The result was a defensive network that was significantly less effective than its designers had intended, creating opportunities for the attacking forces to establish orbital superiority more quickly than anticipated. The initial bombardment of Prospero was conducted with surgical precision, targeting specific installations that intelligence reports had identified as critical to the planet's defenses. The Space Wolves' understanding of urban warfare and siege tactics allowed them to maximize the effectiveness of their orbital strikes, while minimizing collateral damage to areas that might contain valuable intelligence or resources. The bombardment was designed not to destroy the planet, but to create optimal conditions for the ground assault that would follow. Magnus the Red's awareness of the approaching threat came too late to organize an effective defense. The Crimson King had been deep in meditation, attempting to understand the consequences of his psychic warning to the Emperor and the damage he had inadvertently caused to the Imperial Palace. His delayed recognition of the danger allowed the assault force to achieve tactical surprise, landing significant numbers of troops before organized resistance could be mounted. The first wave of the assault focused on securing landing zones and eliminating immediate threats to the invasion force. Space wolves drop pods descended like meteors through Prospero's atmosphere, their occupants emerging ready for immediate combat against defenders who were still struggling to understand the nature and scope of the attack. The combination of shock tactics and overwhelming firepower allowed the attackers to establish secure footholds on the planet's surface within hours of the initial landings. The Thousand Suns' response to the invasion reflected both their tactical capabilities and the limitations imposed by their reliance on psychic powers. Units that attempted to coordinate their defenses through telepathic communication found their abilities disrupted by the null fields generated by the Sisters of Silence. Warriors who had grown accustomed to using sorcery to enhance their combat effectiveness discovered that their most potent abilities were suppressed or completely neutralized in the presence of the pariah gene carriers. The urban combat that characterized much of the fighting on Prospero favored the attacking forces, whose training and equipment had been optimized for exactly these conditions. The Space Wolves moved through the crystalline cities like apex predators, using their enhanced senses to track defenders through the complex maze of streets and buildings. Their pack tactics allowed them to coordinate attacks without relying on electronic communication systems that might have been compromised by the defenders' technological capabilities. The destruction of the Great Library of Tizca represented one of the most tragic losses of the entire campaign. This magnificent structure had housed one of the largest collections of knowledge in the galaxy, containing texts and artifacts that dated back to the Dark Age of technology and beyond. The decision to destroy the library was made not out of spite but from practical necessity, as intelligence reports suggested that many of the volumes contained dangerous information that could not be allowed to fall into the wrong hands. The fighting within the library itself was particularly intense, as Thousand Suns defenders made desperate attempts to preserve as much knowledge as possible, while Space Wolves' assault teams worked to prevent the removal of materials that might pose security risks. The combat took place among towering shelves filled with ancient tomes and scrolls, with both sides recognizing the historical significance of what was being destroyed, even as military necessity demanded its elimination. The confrontation between Leman Russ and Magnus the Red took place in the ruins of the Pyramid of Phodup, the greatest of Prospero's arcane structures. The two Primarchs faced each other across a battlefield littered with the debris of shattered crystal and the bodies of fallen warriors from both sides. The Wolf King approached the confrontation with the grim determination that had characterized his entire military career, while the Crimson King radiated a desperate fury born of watching his life's work being systematically destroyed. The duel between the two Primarchs combined physical combat with psychic warfare on a scale that few mortals had ever witnessed. Magnus unleashed powers that warped reality itself, creating illusions and manifestations that tested the limits of what the material universe could contain. Leman Russ countered these attacks with the savage ferocity that had made him legendary, his enhanced physiology allowing him to withstand psychic assaults that would have destroyed lesser beings, while his weapons sought openings in his brother's defenses. The psychic dimension of their conflict created phenomena that affected the entire battlefield around them. Reality twisted and bent as Magnus channeled energies from the Imperium, while the Wolf King's presence seemed to anchor the material world against these distortions. The combatants moved through landscapes that shifted between the crystalline spires of Prospero and nightmarish visions drawn from the deepest recesses of the warp, their battle transcending the physical realm to encompass struggles on multiple levels of existence. The physical aspect of their duel showcased the combat abilities that had made both Primarchs legendary among their respective legions. Leman Russ wielded his weapons with the precision and ferocity of a born predator, each strike calculated to exploit weaknesses in his opponent's defenses while minimizing his own exposure to counterattack. Magnus fought with a combination of martial skill and psychic enhancement that allowed him to match his brother's physical capabilities, while adding dimensions of attack that conventional warriors could never have anticipated. The tide of battle shifted repeatedly as each Primarch gained temporary advantages only to see them neutralized by their opponent's adaptability and determination. Magnus's psychic powers allowed him to strike from unexpected angles and create defensive barriers that conventional weapons could not penetrate, while Leman Russ's tactical acumen and enhanced physiology enabled him to weather these attacks and respond with devastating counterstrikes that tested the limits of even a Primarch's durability. The intervention of the Space Wolves and Thousand Sons warriors who fought around their respective Primarchs added additional complexity to the confrontation. Both sides recognized that the outcome of the duel between their Gene Fathers would likely determine the fate of the entire campaign, leading to desperate attempts to influence the battle's conclusion. The Space Wolves' coordination and pack tactics allowed them to provide effective support for their Primarch, while minimizing their exposure to Magnus's area effect psychic attacks. The climax of the duel came when Leman Russ managed to land a devastating blow that shattered Magnus's physical form, though whether this represented a true victory or merely the destruction of a psychic projection remained unclear. The Crimson King's apparent death triggered a massive psychic backlash that swept across the battlefield, disrupting the remaining Thousand Sons' resistance and creating the conditions necessary for the assault force to complete its mission objectives. The scattering of the surviving Thousand Sons marked the effective end of organized resistance on Prospero. Those warriors who had not been killed during the fighting found themselves cut off from their command structure and unable to coordinate effective defensive actions. Many chose to fight to the death rather than surrender, while others attempted to escape the planet through whatever means were available. The few who succeeded in fleeing would later regroup in the Eye of Terror, where they would continue to serve their fallen Primarch in his new existence as a demon prince. The aftermath of the burning of Prospero left the Wolf King with a burden of knowledge that would weigh heavily on his conscience for the remainder of his life. The realization that he had been manipulated into destroying a loyal legion, however misguided their actions might have been, represented a betrayal of everything he had believed about duty and loyalty. The discovery of Horus's role in the mission's modification would come later, but the immediate aftermath left Leman Russ questioning whether he had served the Emperor's true interests or merely acted as an unwitting tool in a larger conspiracy. The strategic consequences of the campaign extended far beyond the immediate destruction of the Thousand Sons Legion. The elimination of Magnus and his warriors removed one of the most powerful psychic forces that might have opposed Horus's rebellion, while simultaneously demonstrating the effectiveness of the specialized anti-Astartes capabilities that the Space Wolves had developed. The precedent established by the successful execution of an entire legion would have profound implications for the conduct of the Horus Heresy that was about to engulf the galaxy. The revelation of Horus's treachery struck Leman Russ like a physical blow, the implications cascading through his consciousness with the force of an avalanche. The Wolf King stood in the command chamber of his flagship, the Hrafnkal, surrounded by the wreckage of communications equipment and tactical displays that had brought him the impossible news. His enhanced senses, honed by decades of survival on Fenris, had detected the subtle wrongness in Horus's scent during their final meeting, but he had dismissed these instincts as products of stress and fatigue. Now, as reports flooded in from across the galaxy detailing the War Master's betrayal and the massacre at Istvan III, the true scope of his manipulation became horrifyingly clear. The realization that he had been used as an unwitting weapon against Magnus and the Thousand Sons added a bitter edge to the Wolf King's fury. The modified orders that had transformed a capture mission into an extermination campaign now revealed themselves as part of a larger conspiracy designed to eliminate potential threats to Horus's rebellion. Magnus, for all his arrogance and defiance of the Edict of Nicaea, had been attempting to warn the Emperor of the impending betrayal. The Crimson King's desperate psychic message, which had shattered the barriers protecting Terra, had been an act of loyalty rather than treachery, making Leman Russ an instrument of fratricide rather than imperial justice. The Wolf King's rage manifested in ways that his subordinates had rarely witnessed, his normally controlled demeanor giving way to the primal fury that lurked beneath his civilized exterior. He smashed tactical displays with his bare hands, their reinforced screens shattering like ice beneath the force of his enhanced strength. The howl that escaped his throat echoed through the corridors of the Hraphical, a sound that combined human anguish with the savage cry of a wounded predator. His warriors, veterans who had faced the horrors of a dozen different worlds without flinching, found themselves stepping back from their Primarch as he struggled to contain emotions that threatened to overwhelm even his superhuman self-control. The strategic situation that confronted the Space Wolves in the aftermath of these revelations was dire beyond anything they had previously encountered. The Legion found itself isolated in the galactic north, far from Terra and the Emperor they had sworn to protect. The warp storms that had begun manifesting across the galaxy made communication with Imperial forces sporadic at best, while the vast distances involved meant that even at maximum speed, it would take months to reach the throne world. The Space Wolves were effectively cut off from the broader Imperial war effort at the moment, when their loyalty and capabilities were most desperately needed. The isolation was made worse by the realization that they could no longer trust the standard Imperial communication networks or supply lines. Horus's position as War Master had given him access to the most sensitive Imperial intelligence, including detailed information about the deployment and capabilities of all Space Marine legions. The traitor forces would know exactly where the Space Wolves were located and would have ample opportunity to intercept or misdirect any messages the Legion might attempt to send. Supply convoys that had been dispatched before the rebellion began could no longer be trusted, as their crews might have been suborned or their cargoes contaminated by agents of the War Master. Leman Russ's first priority became the consolidation of his forces and the establishment of secure lines of communication with other loyalist elements. The Space Wolves' fleet scattered across multiple systems was recalled through coded transmissions that relied on Fenrisian battle cant, a linguistic system so specialized that even other Space Marine legions would have difficulty interpreting its meanings. The process of gathering these dispersed elements took precious weeks, time that the Wolf King knew his enemies would use to strengthen their positions and eliminate other potential threats to their rebellion. The intelligence that filtered through to the Space Wolves during this period painted a picture of galactic civil war on a scale that dwarfed any previous conflict in human history. Entire sectors had declared for the War Master, their populations either genuinely converted to his cause or coerced into compliance through threats of orbital bombardment. Space Marine legions that had fought side by side during the Great Crusade now found themselves preparing for fratricidal warfare, while the Imperial army units that formed the backbone of the Crusade forces split along lines of personal loyalty and political calculation. The reports from Istvan V were particularly devastating, confirming that the rebellion had spread far beyond Horus and his Luna Wolves. The massacre of loyalist forces on the black sands of that cursed world had eliminated 3 entire legions and severely damaged several others, removing some of the Emperor's most reliable military assets at a single stroke. The Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard had been virtually destroyed through the treachery of their supposed allies, while the survivors faced the grim prospect of rebuilding their shattered forces while fighting a desperate guerrilla war against overwhelming odds. The Space Wolves' attempts to establish contact with other loyalist forces met with limited success, as the warp storms that accompanied the rebellion made long-range communication unreliable at best. The few messages that did get through painted a picture of confusion and desperation, with Imperial commanders struggling to distinguish between genuine loyalists and potential traitors. The paranoia that gripped the Imperium made it difficult for anyone to trust information from unknown sources, while the scale of the betrayal meant that even the most reliable allies might have been compromised without their knowledge. The Wolf King's strategic planning during this period reflected both his tactical acumen and his understanding of the broader political situation that the heresy had created. The Space Wolves could not simply charge toward Terra in the hope of reaching the Emperor before the traitor forces overwhelmed the throne world's defenses. Such an approach would leave them vulnerable to ambush by superior forces while failing to address the larger strategic challenges that the rebellion presented. Instead, Leman Russ began developing a more sophisticated campaign plan that would allow his legion to contribute meaningfully to the Loyalist cause while working toward their ultimate objective of reaching Terra. The first phase of this campaign focused on eliminating traitor forces in the Space Wolves' immediate vicinity, both to secure their lines of communication and to prevent these enemies from threatening Loyalist supply lines or reinforcement routes. Intelligence reports identified several systems where traitor Imperial army units had established bases, using their positions to interdict shipping and gather intelligence on Loyalist movements. These installations represented immediate threats that needed to be neutralized before the Space Wolves could begin their journey toward the galactic core. The assault on the Caliph system demonstrated the effectiveness of the anti-Astartes tactics that the Space Wolves had developed, even when applied against conventional enemies. The traitor forces that had seized control of the system's industrial facilities were primarily composed of Imperial army regiments that had declared for the War Master, supported by a small contingent of word-bearers who served as advisors and enforcers. The combination of regular human troops and Space Marine leadership created a defensive network that was both formidable and vulnerable to the specialized capabilities that the 6th Legion possessed. The Space Wolves' approach to the Caliph operation reflected their understanding of the psychological as well as tactical challenges involved in fighting former allies. The Legion's reputation for savage ferocity was deliberately emphasized during the preliminary phases of the assault, with reconnaissance forces conducting raids that were designed to terrorize the enemy as much as gather intelligence. The howling of the Space Wolves as they struck from unexpected directions created a psychological impact that went far beyond the physical damage they inflicted, undermining the morale of defenders who had expected to face conventional Imperial forces. The orbital assault that followed demonstrated the Space Wolves' ability to adapt their tactics to the specific requirements of each engagement. Rather than conducting a straightforward planetary invasion, the Legion used their superior mobility to strike simultaneously at multiple targets across the system. Drop pod assaults eliminated key communication nodes and supply depots, while boarding actions captured or destroyed traitor vessels before they could coordinate effective resistance. The result was a campaign that lasted days rather than months, with the traitor forces collapsing under the weight of attacks they could neither predict nor counter. The intelligence gathered during the Caliph operation provided crucial insights into the broader traitor strategy and the extent of the rebellion's reach. Captured documents revealed the existence of supply networks that stretched across multiple sectors, suggesting a level of coordination and planning that had been developing for years before the actual rebellion began. The discovery of these logistics chains allowed the Space Wolves to identify other targets that would disrupt traitor operations while advancing their own strategic objectives. The subsequent campaigns that followed the Caliph victory established a pattern that would characterize the Space Wolves' conduct throughout the early stages of the heresy. The Legion moved through the galactic north like a pack of apex predators, striking at targets of opportunity while gradually working their way toward the more heavily defended systems that controlled access to Terra. Their reputation for savage effectiveness grew with each victory, creating a psychological impact that often preceded their actual arrival in contested systems. The battle for the Dulan Forge world represented one of the most significant engagements of this period, pitting the Space Wolves against a substantial force of Iron Warriors who had seized control of the planet's manufacturing facilities. The Traitor Legion had fortified the world's industrial complexes with typical Iron Warriors' thoroughness, creating defensive networks that could have withstood conventional siege warfare for years. The challenge facing Leman Russ was how to overcome these fortifications without destroying the manufacturing capabilities that made the world valuable to the Loyalist cause. The solution that emerged reflected the Wolf King's understanding of both his own legion's capabilities and the psychological weaknesses of his enemies. Rather than attempting to storm the Iron Warriors' fortifications directly, the Space Wolves conducted a campaign of systematic harassment that was designed to draw the defenders out of their prepared positions. Small pack units infiltrated the industrial complexes through maintenance tunnels and service conduits, striking at targets that were critical to the fortress network's operation, while avoiding direct confrontation with the main defensive forces. The Iron Warriors' response to these tactics revealed the limitations of their rigid approach to warfare. Their defensive plans had been based on the assumption that attackers would follow conventional siege doctrine, attempting to reduce the fortifications through sustained bombardment and frontal assault. The Space Wolves' refusal to conform to these expectations created confusion within the traitor command structure, as officers struggled to adapt their predetermined responses to threats that emerged from unexpected directions. The climax of the Dulan campaign came when the Space Wolves managed to infiltrate the central command complex that controlled the planet's defensive systems. The assault team that penetrated this facility included some of the Legion's most experienced veterans, warriors who had been specifically trained for operations against other Space Marines. Their intimate knowledge of Iron Warriors' tactical doctrine allowed them to anticipate defensive measures and exploit weaknesses that conventional attackers might never have identified. The fighting within the command complex demonstrated the effectiveness of the close-quarters combat techniques that the Space Wolves had developed for anti-Astartes warfare. The confined spaces and complex layouts of the facility negated many of the advantages that the Iron Warriors derived from their heavy weapons and defensive positions, forcing both sides to rely on the kind of brutal hand-to-hand combat that favored the more aggressive and adaptable Space Wolves. The battle raged through corridors and chambers filled with sensitive equipment, with both sides recognizing that the outcome would determine control of the entire planet. The victory at Dulan provided the Space Wolves with access to manufacturing capabilities that would prove crucial for their continued operations. The Forge World's facilities were capable of producing specialized equipment and ammunition types that the Legion required for their anti-Astartes operations, while the planet's strategic location made it an ideal staging area for future campaigns. The establishment of a secure base of operations allowed Leman Russ to begin planning more ambitious operations that would bring his forces closer to their ultimate objective of reaching Terra. The intelligence networks that the Space Wolves established during this period provided increasingly detailed information about the strategic situation throughout the galaxy. Reports from other loyalist forces painted a picture of desperate resistance against overwhelming odds, with Imperial defenders struggling to maintain cohesion in the face of betrayals that struck at every level of the command structure. The Emperor himself had been forced to abandon the Great Crusade and return to Terra, where he worked frantically to complete projects that might provide the weapons necessary to defeat the rebellion. The growing understanding of the heresy's true scope forced Leman Russ to confront the possibility that the Space Wolves might not be able to reach Terra in time to participate in the final battle for the Throne World. The distances involved and the strength of the traitor forces blocking the most direct routes made it increasingly likely that the Legion would arrive to find the war already decided, one way or another. This realization added urgency to the Wolf King's planning, as he sought ways to contribute meaningfully to the Loyalist cause, even if his forces could not reach the Emperor directly. The decision to target the traitor supply lines that supported Horus's advance on Terra represented a strategic shift that would define the Space Wolves' role for the remainder of the heresy. Rather than attempting to fight their way through the traitor forces that blocked the direct route to the Throne World, the Legion would focus on disrupting the logistics networks that made the War Master's campaign possible. This approach offered the possibility of achieving strategic impact without requiring the Space Wolves to engage superior enemy forces in direct confrontation, while also playing to their strengths in mobility and independent operations. The implementation of the Space Wolves' new strategic approach required careful coordination with the few Loyalist forces that remained in contact with the Legion. Intelligence reports filtering through the unreliable warp communications indicated that several other Primarchs were attempting similar disruption campaigns, striking at traitor supply convoys and staging areas wherever opportunities presented themselves. Jagatai Khan and his White Scars had proven particularly effective at these hit-and-run operations, their superior mobility allowing them to strike deep into traitor territory before withdrawing ahead of reinforcements. The coordination between these scattered loyalist forces was minimal, but their combined efforts were beginning to strain the logistics networks that supported Horus's advance. The journey toward the galactic core brought the Space Wolves into increasingly dangerous territory, where traitor forces had established patrol routes and early warning systems designed to intercept loyalist reinforcements attempting to reach Terra. The Legion's fleet had been modified during their operations in the galactic north, with additional armor plating and upgraded void shields that reflected lessons learned from their encounters with traitor naval forces. The ships themselves bore the scars of multiple engagements, their hulls pocked with impact craters and burn marks that told the story of their running battle across the galaxy. The first major obstacle in the Space Wolves' path was the Alax's Nebula, a vast cloud of ionized gas and stellar debris that stretched across multiple light-years of space. The nebula's electromagnetic properties made it a natural hiding place for ambush forces, while its complex internal structure provided numerous choke points where a smaller fleet could potentially trap and destroy a larger one. Intelligence reports suggested that the Alpha Legion had established a significant presence within the nebula, using its concealment to launch raids against loyalist shipping while gathering intelligence on Imperial fleet movements. Leman Russ's decision to transit the nebula rather than attempting the longer route around its periphery reflected both tactical necessity and his understanding of the broader strategic situation. The alternative routes would have added months to the Space Wolves' journey, time that the beleaguered defenders of Terra could not afford to lose. The nebula passage, while dangerous, offered the possibility of reaching the inner systems weeks ahead of schedule if the Legion could successfully navigate its hazards and defeat whatever traitor forces they encountered along the way. The Alpha Legion's presence within the Alax's nebula represented a threat unlike any the Space Wolves had previously encountered. Alpharius and his warriors were masters of deception and misdirection, capable of creating false intelligence networks and phantom fleet movements that could confuse even the most experienced Imperial commanders. Their approach to warfare emphasized subtlety and psychological manipulation over direct confrontation, making them particularly dangerous opponents for a Legion that preferred straightforward tactical solutions to complex strategic problems. The initial probing actions as the Space Wolves' fleet entered the nebula revealed the sophistication of the Alpha Legion's defensive preparations. Sensor contacts appeared and disappeared without warning, creating the impression of a much larger force than actually existed while concealing the true positions of enemy vessels. Communication jamming and electronic warfare systems disrupted the Space Wolves' coordination, forcing individual ship commanders to operate independently while maintaining formation through visual signals and predetermined tactical protocols. The first direct engagement occurred when a squadron of Space Wolves escorts encountered what appeared to be a damaged Alpha Legion cruiser drifting powerless through a dense gas cloud. The vessel's distress signals and apparent vulnerability suggested an opportunity to capture valuable intelligence or eliminate an enemy ship without significant risk. However, the approach revealed the encounter to be an elaborate trap, with the supposedly crippled cruiser suddenly powering up its weapons, while concealed Alpha Legion vessels emerged from the surrounding gas clouds to catch the Space Wolves squadron in a deadly crossfire. The battle that followed demonstrated both the effectiveness of Alpha Legion deception tactics and the adaptability that had made the Space Wolves legendary throughout the Great Crusade. The escort squadron found itself outnumbered and outgunned, but their commander's intimate knowledge of pack hunting tactics allowed them to coordinate their movements in ways that the Alpha Legion had not anticipated. Rather than attempting to fight their way out of the trap through conventional maneuvers, the Space Wolves vessels began moving in seemingly random patterns that gradually drew their opponents into positions where they could be engaged individually rather than as a coordinated formation. The destruction of 2 Alpha Legion vessels during this engagement provided the Space Wolves with their first significant victory within the nebula, but it also revealed the true scope of the enemy presence in the region. Captured communications equipment and interrogated survivors indicated that the Alpha Legion had been operating within the Alax's nebula for months, establishing hidden bases and supply caches that could support extended operations against Imperial shipping. The intelligence gathered from these sources suggested that the traitor force was significantly larger than initial estimates had indicated, with multiple battle groups operating independently while maintaining coordination through encrypted communication networks. The main body of the Space Wolves fleet encountered increasingly sophisticated resistance as it pushed deeper into the nebula's core regions. Alpha Legion vessels appeared without warning from concealed positions, launching devastating attacks before withdrawing into the gas clouds, where pursuit was nearly impossible. The hit-and-run tactics that characterized these engagements were designed to inflict maximum damage while avoiding decisive confrontation, gradually wearing down the Space Wolves through accumulated losses rather than attempting to destroy them in a single massive battle. Leman Russ's response to these tactics reflected his understanding of both his own Legion's strengths and the psychological warfare that the Alpha Legion was attempting to conduct. Rather than allowing his forces to be drawn into a prolonged campaign of attrition, the Wolf King ordered his fleet to adopt an aggressive posture that would force the enemy into the kind of direct confrontation they were trying to avoid. The Space Wolves began moving in tight formation through the nebula's most dangerous regions, presenting a target too valuable for the Alpha Legion to ignore, while maintaining sufficient firepower to handle whatever response their provocation might generate. The climactic battle of the Alax's Nebula campaign began when the Alpha Legion finally committed their main force to a coordinated assault on the Space Wolves' fleet. The enemy formation that emerged from the gas clouds was larger and more sophisticated than anything the 6th Legion had encountered during their journey, with capital ships supported by numerous escorts and specialized vessels designed for operations within the nebula's unique environment. The Alpha Legion's approach emphasized coordination and mutual support, with each vessel positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire while maintaining the flexibility to withdraw if the engagement turned against them. The Space Wolves' response to this challenge showcased the tactical innovations that had been developed during their campaigns against other Space Marine forces. Rather than engaging in the kind of formal fleet action that the Alpha Legion had prepared for, the 6th Legion's vessels began operating as independent hunting packs, each group targeting specific enemy ships while avoiding the coordinated defensive fire that made frontal assaults prohibitively costly. This approach disrupted the Alpha Legion's carefully planned formations, forcing their commanders to adapt to a style of warfare that their tactical doctrine had not anticipated. The battle raged across multiple sectors of the nebula, with individual engagements occurring simultaneously throughout the region as both fleets maneuvered for tactical advantage. The Space Wolves' superior coordination and aggressive tactics gradually began to tell, as Alpha Legion vessels found themselves isolated and overwhelmed by enemies who refused to conform to predictable patterns of behavior. The psychological impact of facing opponents who seemed to anticipate their every move began to affect the traitor fleet's performance, creating hesitation and uncertainty where confidence and precision had previously existed. The personal combat between Leman Russ and Alfarius occurred when the 2 Primarch's flagships closed to boarding range during the height of the fleet engagement. The Wolf King had identified his brother's vessel through a combination of tactical analysis and the enhanced senses that allowed him to detect the unique psychic signature that each Primarch possessed. The decision to initiate boarding action was characteristic of Leman Russ's direct approach to warfare, seeking to end the battle through personal combat rather than allowing it to continue as a prolonged fleet engagement that might favor his more subtle opponent. The fighting aboard the Alpha Legion flagship revealed the extent to which Alfarius had modified his vessel for the kind of close-quarters combat that boarding actions required. The ship's internal layout had been redesigned to create killing zones and defensive positions that could channel attackers into predetermined areas where they could be eliminated efficiently. Hidden weapon systems and concealed blast doors turned routine passages into death traps, while the vessel's life support systems had been modified to allow the deployment of chemical weapons and atmospheric toxins that could incapacitate intruders without damaging sensitive equipment. The Space Wolves boarding parties that fought their way through these defenses demonstrated the effectiveness of the anti-Astartes training that had been developed specifically for operations against other Space Marines. Their intimate knowledge of power armor systems and Space Marine tactical doctrine allowed them to anticipate and counter many of the defensive measures they encountered, while their pack-based coordination enabled them to support each other in ways that individual warriors could not match. The savage ferocity that characterized Fenrisian culture proved particularly effective in the confined spaces of the enemy vessel, where conventional tactics were less useful than raw aggression and adaptability. The confrontation between the two Primarchs took place in the flagship's command center, a chamber that had been specifically designed to showcase the Alpha Legion's technological sophistication and tactical capabilities. Banks of communication equipment and tactical displays lined the walls, their screens showing the progress of the fleet engagement, while encrypted transmissions coordinated the activities of Alpha Legion forces throughout the nebula. The chamber itself was a testament to the 20th Legion's approach to warfare, emphasizing information control and coordination over the more direct methods favored by other Space Marine forces. Fenris fought with a combination of martial skill and tactical cunning that reflected his legion's approach to warfare. His weapons and armor incorporated technologies that the Space Wolves had not encountered before, including adaptive camouflage systems that made him difficult to target and weapons that could penetrate even Primarch-grade protection through exotic ammunition types. The Alpha Legion Primarch's fighting style emphasized misdirection and deception, using feints and false attacks to create openings for devastating counterstrikes, while maintaining defensive positions that minimized his exposure to retaliation. Leman Russ's response to these tactics drew upon decades of experience fighting the most dangerous predators that Fenris could produce. His enhanced senses allowed him to track his opponent even when camouflage systems made visual targeting impossible, while his understanding of pack hunting techniques enabled him to anticipate and counter the misdirection tactics that Fenris employed. The Wolf King's weapons had been specifically modified for anti-Primarch combat, incorporating technologies that could penetrate even the most sophisticated defensive systems, while delivering the kind of devastating damage that could threaten even genetically enhanced opponents. The duel between the two Primarchs raged throughout the command center, their superhuman speed and strength turning the sophisticated chamber into a battlefield littered with destroyed equipment and structural debris. The combat was unlike the formal duels that had characterized some Primarch confrontations, instead resembling the kind of savage struggle for survival that might occur between apex predators competing for territory. Both combatants sustained significant injuries during the fighting, their enhanced healing abilities the only thing that allowed them to continue functioning despite wounds that would have been instantly fatal to normal humans. The turning point in their confrontation came when Leman Russ managed to land a devastating blow that shattered several of Fenris's ribs and punctured one of his lungs. The Alpha Legion Primarch's sophisticated armor systems prevented the wound from being immediately fatal, but the injury significantly reduced his mobility and combat effectiveness. The Wolf King pressed his advantage with the relentless aggression that had made him legendary, forcing his wounded opponent to adopt increasingly desperate defensive measures as his condition continued to deteriorate. The final moments of the duel saw Fenris attempting to use the command center's remaining systems to coordinate a counterattack that might save both his flagship and his life. The Alpha Legion Primarch's fingers flew across control interfaces as he tried to activate hidden weapon systems and call for reinforcements from other vessels in his fleet. However, the damage that the boarding parties had inflicted on the ship's internal systems prevented many of these commands from being executed, while the Space Wolves' control of key passages made it impossible for reinforcements to reach the command center in time to affect the outcome. Leman Russ's killing blow came as Alfarius attempted to activate what appeared to be a self-destruct system that would have destroyed both Primarchs along with their respective flagships. The Wolf King's enhanced reflexes allowed him to intercept his brother's hand before it could complete the activation sequence, while his weapon found the weak points in the Alpha Legion Primarch's armor that had been created by their prolonged combat. The death of Alfarius sent psychic shockwaves throughout the Alpha Legion fleet, disrupting their coordination and creating the confusion necessary for the Space Wolves to achieve decisive victory in the broader engagement. The aftermath of the Battle of Alax's Nebula left the Space Wolves victorious, but significantly weakened by the losses they had sustained during the fighting. The Legion's fleet had been reduced by nearly a third, with several capital ships destroyed or too badly damaged to continue the journey toward Terra. The casualties among the Space Marines themselves were equally severe, with entire companies having been wiped out during the boarding actions and fleet engagements that characterized the battle. The survivors bore the physical and psychological scars of having fought one of the most challenging campaigns in the Legion's history. The intelligence gathered from captured Alpha Legion vessels and installations provided crucial insights into the broader traitor strategy and the extent of the rebellion's reach. Documents and communication records revealed the existence of sleeper cells and hidden supply networks that stretched throughout the galaxy, suggesting that the Alpha Legion's influence extended far beyond their visible military presence. The discovery of these covert operations forced the Space Wolves to reconsider their assumptions about the security of their own supply lines and communication networks, adding new layers of complexity to their strategic planning. The journey toward Terra continued through increasingly hostile territory, where the Space Wolves encountered evidence of the devastation that the heresy had brought to countless worlds. Entire systems had been reduced to lifeless husks by orbital bombardment, while others showed signs of the demonic corruption that accompanied the traitor forces wherever they went. The psychological impact of witnessing this destruction weighed heavily on the Legion's warriors, who had spent their lives fighting to protect humanity, only to see it tearing itself apart in civil war. The coordination with other loyalist forces became increasingly important as the Space Wolves approached the inner systems, where the final battles of the heresy would be fought. Communication with Jagatai Khan's White Scars revealed that the 5th Legion had also suffered significant losses during their own journey toward Terra, though their superior mobility had allowed them to avoid some of the more devastating encounters that had characterized the Space Wolves campaign. The two Primarchs began coordinating their movements to provide mutual support during the final approach to the throne world, recognizing that their combined strength would be necessary to break through the traitor forces that surrounded the Emperor's domain. The growing awareness of the heresy's true scope and the role that chaos played in corrupting the traitor Primarchs began to affect Leman Russ's understanding of his own actions during the burning of Prospero. The Wolf King's encounters with demonic entities and chaos-corrupted space marines provided context for Magnus's warnings about the dangers of uncontrolled psychic experimentation, while also revealing the extent to which the ruinous powers had been manipulating events throughout the Great Crusade. The realization that his destruction of the Thousand Suns had served chaos rather than imperial interests added another layer of guilt and determination to his drive to reach Terra and stand beside the Emperor in the final battle. The immediate aftermath of the Siege of Terra found the Imperium in a state of barely controlled chaos, its institutions shattered by 7 years of civil war, and its territories scarred by betrayals that had reached into the highest levels of imperial command. The Emperor's internment within the Golden Throne had created a power vacuum that the surviving loyalist Primarchs struggled to fill, while across the galaxy, remnants of the traitor legions continued to wage guerrilla campaigns against imperial forces. For Leman Russ, the transition from the desperate defense of the throne world to the systematic hunting of fleeing enemies represented a return to the kind of warfare that the Space Wolves understood best. The Great Scouring began as an uncoordinated series of pursuit actions launched by individual loyalist commanders seeking to capitalize on the traitor forces' disarray following Horus's death. The Wolf King recognized that these scattered efforts, while individually successful, lacked the strategic coordination necessary to eliminate the traitor threat permanently. His experience as the Emperor's executioner had taught him that half measures in dealing with corrupted Space Marines inevitably led to future problems, as survivors would regroup and return stronger than before. The lesson of Magnus and the Thousand Suns weighed heavily on his mind as he contemplated the scale of the task ahead. The Space Wolves' participation in the Scouring reflected their unique capabilities and the bitter lessons learned during the Heresy. The Legion had been reduced to perhaps 60% of its pre-war strength, with entire great companies having been destroyed during the fighting at Terra and the long campaign to reach the throne world. However, the survivors were veterans of the most brutal conflicts in Imperial history, warriors who had proven their ability to fight and defeat other Space Marines under the most challenging conditions. Their expertise in anti-Astartes warfare made them invaluable assets in the systematic elimination of traitor forces. The first major operation of the Scouring that involved significant Space Wolves' participation was the pursuit of the Word-Bearers through the Ultima Segmentum. Lorgar's Legion had withdrawn from Terra in relatively good order, their fanatical devotion to the Chaos Gods providing them with the discipline necessary to conduct an organized retreat despite the collapse of the broader traitor cause. Intelligence reports suggested that the 17th Legion was attempting to establish strongholds in systems where chaos cults had prepared the ground for their arrival, creating the foundation for a long-term insurgency that could threaten Imperial stability for decades to come. The campaign against the Word-Bearers demonstrated the evolution of Space Wolves' tactics during the Heresy, as the Legion had adapted their traditional pack hunting methods to the specific challenges of fighting chaos-corrupted enemies. The Word-Bearers' use of demonic allies and reality-warping sorcery required countermeasures that went beyond conventional anti-Astartes techniques, forcing the Space Wolves to develop new approaches that combined their enhanced senses with specialized equipment designed to detect and neutralize supernatural threats. The Rune Priests played a crucial role in these operations, their shamanic traditions providing protection against chaos corruption, while their abilities allowed them to track enemies who might otherwise remain hidden through sorcerous means. The destruction of the Word-Bearers' stronghold at Calth's Revenge marked one of the most significant victories of the early Scouring period. The Traitor Legion had fortified a series of asteroid mining facilities in the system's outer reaches, using the complex three-dimensional battlefield to their advantage, while drawing power from chaos shrines hidden throughout the installations. The Space Wolves' assault on these positions required careful coordination between multiple great companies, each tasked with eliminating specific targets while preventing the enemy from concentrating their forces for effective resistance. The fighting within the asteroid facilities showcased the brutal efficiency that had made the Space Wolves legendary during the Great Crusade. The confined spaces and industrial hazards of the mining installations created an environment where conventional tactics were less effective than the kind of savage close-quarters combat that Fenrisian culture had perfected. Space Wolves' pack leaders used their enhanced senses to track word-bearers through maintenance tunnels and processing chambers, while their warriors demonstrated the same relentless aggression that had served them during the boarding actions of the Heresy. The psychological impact of these victories extended far beyond their immediate tactical significance. The Space Wolves' reputation for implacable pursuit and savage retribution began to affect traitor morale throughout the galaxy, as word spread that the Wolf King's warriors would follow their enemies to the ends of the galaxy if necessary. This reputation served as both a tactical advantage and a strategic weapon, causing some traitor forces to make desperate stands rather than attempting to withdraw, while encouraging others to surrender rather than face the Space Wolves in combat. The rebuilding of the Space Wolves' Legion during the Scouring required careful balance between maintaining operational effectiveness and integrating new recruits who lacked the combat experience of the heresy veterans. The traditional recruitment practices that drew aspirants from Fenris's tribal populations continued, but the selection criteria were modified to identify candidates who possessed the psychological resilience necessary to fight chaos-corrupted enemies. The trials that tested potential Space Marines were expanded to include exposure to minor demonic influences, ensuring that new warriors would not be vulnerable to the kind of corruption that had claimed so many during the Civil War. The establishment of the Space Wolves' new role within the post-heresy Imperium reflected both their proven capabilities and the changed nature of the threats that humanity faced. The emergence of chaos as a permanent enemy rather than a temporary aberration required military forces that were specifically trained and equipped to handle supernatural threats. The Space Wolves' combination of Astartes' expertise and resistance to chaos corruption made them ideal candidates for operations that other Imperial forces might find impossible to complete successfully. The Codex Astartes reforms proposed by Robute Guilliman created significant tensions within the Space Wolves hierarchy, as the prescribed organizational structure conflicted directly with the pact-based system that had served the Legion throughout its history. Leman Russ found himself caught between his respect for his brother Primarch and his conviction that the Fenrisian way of war was superior to any standardized doctrine. The debates that followed revealed fundamental philosophical differences about the nature of military organization and the proper relationship between individual initiative and centralized command. The Wolf King's arguments against the Codex reforms emphasized the practical advantages that the Great Company system provided in the kind of warfare that the post-heresy Imperium would face. The flexibility and adaptability that characterized Space Wolves' organization allowed them to respond quickly to changing tactical situations, while the personal bonds between pack members provided psychological resilience that formal military hierarchies could not match. The specialized nature of anti-chaos operations required the kind of individual initiative and creative problem-solving that rigid doctrine tended to suppress. The compromise that eventually emerged allowed the Space Wolves to maintain their traditional organization while accepting certain aspects of the Codex that enhanced their operational effectiveness. The Legion was officially divided into multiple chapters, though these formations continued to operate as great companies under the authority of Wolf Lords who answered directly to Leman Russ. The integration of Codex-compliant support elements and standardized equipment specifications improved the Space Wolves' logistical capabilities while preserving the cultural traditions that define their identity. The growing bureaucratization of the Imperium under the High Lords of Terra created increasing frustration for Leman Russ, whose direct approach to leadership conflicted with the complex administrative procedures that were becoming standard throughout Imperial institutions. The Wolf King had spent his life making decisions based on immediate tactical requirements and long-term strategic objectives, but the new Imperial system required extensive documentation and approval processes that seemed designed to prevent decisive action rather than enable it. The delays and inefficiencies that resulted from these procedures cost lives and opportunities that could not be recovered. The establishment of the Inquisition represented a particular source of tension, as the new organization's mandate to investigate and eliminate threats to Imperial security overlapped significantly with the Space Wolves' traditional role as the Emperor's executioners. The Inquisitors' methods emphasized investigation and analysis over direct action, while their authority to requisition Imperial forces and resources created potential conflicts with Space Marine operational autonomy. Several early encounters between Space Wolves forces and Inquisition representatives resulted in jurisdictional disputes that required intervention from the highest levels of Imperial command. The philosophical evolution that Leman Russ underwent during this period reflected his growing understanding of the complexities involved in governing a galactic empire. The simple certainties that had guided his actions during the Great Crusade and Heresy were no longer adequate to address the multifaceted challenges that the post-war Imperium faced. The Wolf King found himself grappling with questions of justice and governance that had no clear answers, situations where the application of force alone could not provide satisfactory solutions to underlying problems. The rebellion on Grendel's world illustrated these complexities in stark detail. The planet's population had risen against imperial rule following the discovery that their planetary governor had been collaborating with chaos cultists during the heresy. The rebels' grievances were legitimate, but their methods included attacks on imperial installations and personnel that could not be ignored. The Space Wolves were tasked with restoring order, but Leman Russ recognized that simple suppression would not address the underlying issues that had caused the rebellion in the first place. The solution that emerged required careful negotiation between the various factions involved, with the Space Wolves serving as both enforcers and mediators in a process that took months to complete. The Wolf King's personal involvement in these negotiations demonstrated his growing sophistication as a political leader, though the experience left him frustrated with the limitations that political considerations placed on military effectiveness. The compromise that was eventually reached satisfied none of the parties completely, but provided a foundation for long-term stability that pure force could not have achieved. The increasing frequency of such complex situations throughout the Imperium began to wear on Leman Russ's patience and confidence in his ability to serve effectively as both a military commander and political leader. The straightforward warrior who had united the tribes of Fenris found himself struggling with administrative responsibilities that seemed to grow more complex with each passing year. The bureaucratic machinery that surrounded him required constant attention to details that seemed irrelevant to the larger strategic challenges facing humanity. The Wolf King's growing disillusionment manifested in increasingly frequent returns to Fenris, where he could reconnect with the cultural traditions and natural environment that had shaped his character. These visits provided temporary respite from the pressures of imperial service, but they also highlighted the growing distance between his personal values and the institutional requirements of his position. The pact bonds that had sustained him throughout his career were being strained by responsibilities that isolated him from the warriors he had led for so long. The question of succession began to occupy more of Leman Russ's attention as he contemplated the possibility that his service to the Imperium might eventually require him to step aside in favor of leaders better suited to the administrative challenges of the post-heresy era. The identification and training of potential successors within the Space Wolves hierarchy became a priority that required careful consideration of both military capabilities and political acumen. The Wolf King recognized that the next generation of imperial leaders would need skills that differed significantly from those that had served during the Great Crusade and Heresy. The establishment of new training programs within the Space Wolves reflected this understanding, as young officers were exposed to the kinds of complex scenarios they would face as the Imperium continued to evolve. These programs emphasized not just tactical and strategic thinking, but also the diplomatic and administrative skills that would be necessary for effective leadership in the changing imperial system. The integration of these new approaches with traditional Fenrisian values required careful balance to preserve the Legion's essential character while preparing it for future challenges. The mounting administrative burdens of the post-heresy Imperium weighed increasingly heavily on Leman Russ as the decades passed following the Great Scouring. The Wolf King found himself trapped between his nature as a warrior and the political realities of governing a fractured galaxy. Each day brought new reports requiring his attention, supply requisitions from distant worlds, diplomatic protests from planetary governors, and theological disputes that seemed to multiply like spores in the wake of the Emperor's internment upon the Golden Throne. The simple certainties of pack loyalty and martial honor that had guided him since his youth on Fenris seemed inadequate tools for navigating the labyrinthine bureaucracy that the Imperium had become. The transformation of imperial society troubled Leman Russ on a fundamental level. The warrior culture that had driven the Great Crusade was giving way to an increasingly rigid hierarchy of administrators and functionaries who measured success in processed documents rather than conquered worlds. The Space Wolves found themselves spending more time in conference rooms than on battlefields, their expertise in warfare increasingly subordinated to the requirements of an administrative machine that seemed to exist primarily to perpetuate itself. The Wolf King watched with growing dismay as the Imperium his father had envisioned became something unrecognizable. The establishment of the ecclesiarchy as the official imperial church created particular friction with the Space Wolves' traditional beliefs. The shamanic practices that had sustained the Legion since its founding were viewed with suspicion by the new religious authorities, who saw any deviation from approved doctrine as potential heresy. The rune priests found themselves subject to increasing scrutiny, their ancient traditions questioned by theologians who had never set foot on Fenris or witnessed the harsh realities that had shaped those customs. The Wolf King's attempts to protect his warriors' spiritual practices required diplomatic maneuvering that went against every instinct he possessed. The growing influence of the Inquisition represented another source of constant tension. The organization's mandate to investigate threats to imperial security inevitably brought them into conflict with the Space Wolves' operational methods. Inquisitors demanded detailed reports on Legion activities, questioned the loyalty of warriors who had fought beside the Emperor himself, and attempted to insert their agents into Space Wolves' operations. The Wolf King's patience with these intrusions grew thinner with each passing year, particularly when inquisitorial interference resulted in delayed responses to genuine threats. The bureaucratic machinery surrounding the Space Wolves expanded relentlessly, requiring ever larger staffs to handle the documentation and compliance requirements imposed by various imperial institutions. The Fang, the Legion's fortress monastery on Fenris, gradually filled with scribes and administrators whose work seemed disconnected from the martial traditions that had built the structure. The Wolf King found himself spending more time reviewing reports than planning operations, his days consumed by meetings that produced more meetings rather than actionable decisions. The question of the Legion's future became increasingly pressing as Leman Russ contemplated the changes occurring throughout the Imperium. The Codex Astartes had been implemented across most other Space Marine forces, creating standardized organizational structures and tactical doctrines that prioritized predictability over adaptability. While the Space Wolves had been granted exemptions from many of these requirements, the pressure to conform continued to mount as other imperial institutions struggled to coordinate with forces that operated outside established parameters. The Wolf King's growing disillusionment manifested in increasingly frequent hunting expeditions into Fenris's wilderness, where he could escape the administrative burdens of command and reconnect with the primal instincts that had shaped his character. These journeys took him to the most remote regions of the Death World, places where the aurora danced across endless ice fields, and the howling of wolf packs carried messages older than human civilization. The solitude provided temporary relief from the pressures of imperial service, but it also highlighted the growing distance between his personal nature and the requirements of his position. The discovery of the Chaos Cult on Fenris itself represented a profound shock that shattered many of the Wolf King's remaining assumptions about the post-Heresy galaxy. The infiltration of his own homeworld by servants of the ruinous powers demonstrated that nowhere was truly safe from corruption, that even the most carefully guarded traditions could be subverted by patient enemies. The investigation that followed revealed the extent to which Chaos had adapted its methods since the heresy, using subtlety and gradual influence rather than open rebellion to achieve its objectives. The purge of the cultists required the kind of brutal efficiency that the Space Wolves had perfected during the Scouring, but the psychological impact of fighting corrupted Fenrisians weighed heavily on the Legion's warriors. These were not distant enemies or alien threats, but people who shared their cultural heritage and spoke their language. The realization that Chaos could corrupt even the hardy survivors of Fenris forced a fundamental reassessment of the Legion's security procedures and recruitment practices. The aftermath of the Fenris incident accelerated Leman Russ's growing conviction that his continued presence was becoming counterproductive to the Imperium's long-term stability. The administrative systems that had evolved since the heresy required leaders who could work within established frameworks rather than warriors who preferred direct action to bureaucratic process. The Wolf King recognized that his instinctive responses to problems often created complications that more diplomatically minded commanders could have avoided. The decision to undertake one final great hunt crystallized gradually as Leman Russ contemplated the legends and prophecies that had shaped Fenrisian culture for millennia. The shamanic traditions spoke of a time when the greatest warriors would depart on hunts that would take them beyond the mortal realm, pursuing prey that existed in dimensions beyond normal understanding. The Wolf King began to see parallels between these ancient stories and his own situation, viewing his growing dissatisfaction with imperial service as a sign that his true purpose lay elsewhere. The preparation for this final journey required careful consideration of the Space Wolves' future leadership structure. The Wolf King spent months evaluating potential successors among his Wolf Lords, assessing their capabilities not just as military commanders, but as political leaders who could navigate the complex relationships that characterized the post-heresy Imperium. The selection process emphasized adaptability and diplomatic skill alongside the martial prowess that had traditionally defined Space Wolves' leadership. The great companies were restructured to operate more independently, with each Wolf Lord granted expanded authority to handle situations that might previously have required the Primarch's direct involvement. This decentralization reflected Leman Russ's understanding that the Imperium's size and complexity made centralized command increasingly impractical. The changes were implemented gradually to minimize disruption to ongoing operations, while ensuring that the Legion could continue functioning effectively in his absence. The intelligence networks that had served the Space Wolves throughout the heresy and scouring were expanded and formalized, creating information gathering capabilities that could operate independently of the Primarch's personal involvement. These networks emphasized the detection of chaos corruption and the monitoring of potential threats to Imperial stability, reflecting the lessons learned from the Fenris incident and the broader challenges facing the post-war galaxy. The final gathering of the Space Wolves' leadership took place in the Great Hall of the Fang, beneath banners that bore the battle honors of campaigns stretching back to the earliest days of the Great Crusade. The assembled Wolf Lords represented the finest warriors the Legion had produced, veterans whose scars told the story of humanity's struggle against its enemies. The atmosphere was heavy with the weight of tradition and the uncertainty of an approaching transition that would fundamentally alter the Legion's character. Leman Russ's final address to his warriors drew upon the shamanic traditions that had sustained Fenrisian culture through countless generations of hardship and conflict. He spoke of the great hunt that awaited him, a pursuit that would take him into the warp itself in search of a cure for the Emperor's condition. The Tree of Life mentioned in ancient legends might exist somewhere beyond the material realm, its healing properties capable of restoring the master of mankind to his former glory. The quest would be dangerous beyond measure, requiring him to traverse regions where the laws of reality held no sway, and where the servants of chaos wielded power that defied comprehension. The Wolftime prophecy that had been preserved in Fenrisian oral tradition provided the framework for understanding this departure. The ancient seers had spoken of a time when the galaxy would face its greatest trial, when the forces of darkness would seem on the verge of final victory. In that hour of ultimate need, the Wolf King would return with the Einherjar, the chosen dead who had proven themselves worthy of eternal battle. This return would herald the final confrontation between order and chaos, a conflict that would determine the fate of all existence. The practical arrangements for the Legion's continued operation were finalized during the weeks following this gathering. The most experienced Wolf Lords were granted additional responsibilities, while younger commanders were assigned mentors who could guide their development during the challenging period ahead. The recruitment and training programs were modified to emphasize the qualities that would be necessary for survival in an increasingly hostile galaxy, while the Legion's equipment and supply systems were reorganized to operate without direct Primarch oversight. The departure itself was conducted with the kind of understated ceremony that characterized Fenrisian culture. There were no grand parades or elaborate speeches, just a simple gathering of warriors who understood that they were witnessing the end of an era. Leman Russ boarded a small vessel that had been specially modified for warp travel, its hull inscribed with protective runes and its systems blessed according to ancient traditions. The ship's destination was known only to the Wolf King himself, though the shamanic rites suggested that his path would take him to regions where time and space held different meanings. The space wolves who remained behind faced the challenge of maintaining their identity and effectiveness without the leadership that had defined them for centuries. The transition was not without difficulties, as different factions within the Legion held varying opinions about how to interpret their Primarch's final instructions. Some advocated for strict adherence to traditional methods, while others argued for adaptation to the changing requirements of Imperial service. These debates reflected broader questions about the role of Space Marine chapters in the evolving Imperial system. The legacy of Leman Russ's departure extended far beyond the immediate impact on the Space Wolves Legion. His final hunt became part of Imperial mythology, inspiring countless tales and legends that spread throughout human space. The prophecy of his return provided hope during the darkest periods of Imperial history, when Xeno's invasions and Chaos incursions threatened to overwhelm humanity's defenses. The belief that the Wolf King would return when the need was greatest became a source of strength for Imperial forces facing impossible odds. The influence of Fenrisian culture on the wider Imperium grew in the centuries following Leman Russ's departure, as the traditions he had championed were adopted by other military organizations seeking to improve their effectiveness. The pack-based tactical doctrines developed by the Space Wolves influenced the formation of specialized units throughout the Imperial military, while the shamanic practices that had protected the Legion from chaos corruption were studied and adapted by other forces facing similar threats. The ongoing search for the Wolf King became a recurring theme in Imperial history, with various expeditions launched into the warp in attempts to locate him or discover evidence of his activities. These missions rarely returned, and those that did brought only fragmentary reports of strange encounters and impossible visions. The mystery surrounding his fate added to the legend, creating a mythology that transcended the historical reality of his achievements during the Great Crusade and Heresy. The Space Wolves themselves evolved in response to their Primarch's absence, developing new traditions and capabilities while maintaining the essential character that had defined them since their founding. The great companies became increasingly independent, each developing specialized roles that reflected the particular strengths and interests of their leadership. This diversification allowed the chapter to respond more effectively to the varied threats facing the Imperium, while preserving the cultural unity that bound all Space Wolves together. The Wolftime prophecy remained a central element of Space Wolves' belief, providing both comfort and motivation during the long millennia of service that followed their Primarch's departure. The promise of eventual return gave meaning to their continued struggles, while the responsibility of preparing for that return ensured that they maintained the standards of excellence that Leman Russ had demanded. The legend of the Wolf King's final hunt became inseparable from the identity of his sons, defining their purpose and guiding their actions across the ages. As the centuries turned to millennia, the departure of Leman Russ into the warp marked not an ending, but a transformation. The Wolf King had recognized that his greatest service to the Imperium lay not in continued administrative leadership, but in the pursuit of a cure that might restore the Emperor and provide humanity with the guidance it desperately needed. His final hunt represented the ultimate expression of the loyalty and determination that had characterized his entire existence, a quest that embodied the very essence of what it meant to be a space wolf. The legend of his return would endure as long as humanity itself survived, a beacon of hope in the darkness of the far future.